She was 11 years old, barefoot, quiet, forgotten by history. And yet, every single day, more money flowed from the ground beneath her name than the President of the United States earned in a year. She didn't drill the oil. She didn't sign the contracts. She couldn't even touch the money because the law said she didn't belong to it. In early 1900s Oklahoma, a poor black child named Sarah Rector became one of the richest people in America. Not by choice, not by ambition, but by accident. Then the court stepped in. A white guardian was appointed, and suddenly, the fortune that carried her name no longer reached her hands. Newspapers called her the richest Negro girl in the world, but she still lived like a child who owned nothing. So here's the question no one wanted to ask. How does a child become a millionaire and still have no power over her own life? This is not just a story about oil. It's a story about race, law, silence, and what America does when wealth falls into the wrong hands. Stay with me, because the truth beneath this land runs deeper than oil. Oklahoma, at the turn of the 20th century, was a land that never truly slept, even when everything seemed still. The earth breathed. The wind was always there, low, persistent, restless. It swept across the plains carrying red dust from one horizon to the other, slipping through cracks in wooden walls, settling on windowsills, clinging to skin and clothing like a reminder that nothing here was ever fully owned. The land did not belong to the people. The people merely endured it, in a small settlement near Taft, far from the growing noise of cities and railroads. Lived the Rector family. They were not important. They were not powerful. They were barely noticed at all. Joseph Rector was a man shaped by work. His hands were thick and scarred, the kind of hands that spoke before his mouth ever did. He took whatever labor he could find, mending fences, hauling timber, working fields that were never his. His wife, Rose, kept their small wooden house together with quiet discipline. The floors were swept clean, the stove was scrubbed, the children were fed, if only just enough. They belonged to a group the law called Creek freedmen, once enslaved by members of the Creek Nation. Their ancestors had walked west after the Civil War, freed but never fully free, when treaties were signed and territories renamed. They were folded into citizenship with an asterisk attached. Citizens, but not equals, counted, but never trusted. Their names appeared on government rolls, lists compiled not to protect them, but to control them, bloodlines reduced to ink, identity flattened into numbers. In that world, on a cool morning in March of 1902, Sarah Rector was born. Her first cry did not echo in a hospital. It rose inside a modest cabin with thin walls and a leaky roof. Outside, roosters crowed. A train whistle sounded faintly in the distance. Life went on, indifferent to the arrival of another child destined for obscurity. Sarah grew up small and quiet. She learned early how to disappear into corners, how to listen more than speak. Her childhood was made of chores and dust, fetching water, helping her mother wash clothes at the creek, shucking corn by lamplight. Summers buzzed with cicadas and heat so heavy it pressed against the lungs. Winters were sharp and unforgiving, the wind slicing through coats that were never thick enough. On Sundays, the family walked to a one-room church where hymns were sung from worn books and prayers rose like smoke. Rose would dress Sarah in a clean cotton dress, faded but carefully pressed, and whisper words she herself had learned long ago. Dignity is something you carry, not something you're given. Sarah remembered that. She remembered the smell of wood smoke and iron-rich soil. She remembered the way the sky seemed impossibly wide at night. stars scattered like spilled grain. She remembered her father standing in the doorway some evenings, staring out at the land as if it were an unanswered question, and then, quietly, without ceremony, without meaning, the government gave her something. Under the Daw Act and the Curtis Act, tribal lands were broken apart and redistributed. Each registered citizen, even children, received an allotment. To Washington, it was paperwork. To families like the Rectors, it was survival wrapped in confusion. When Sarah's name came up, she was assigned 160 acres of land. It lay near Glenpool, rocky, dry, unforgiving. No stream, no fertile soil, no promise of crops. White officials shrugged when Joseph asked about it. "Worthless land," they said. "More burden than blessing." And at first, they were right. The land could not feed the family, but it could tax them. Every year. The bill came due, $30. A small number to men who owned banks and railroads, a crushing weight to a man who earned coins one job at a time. Joseph counted those coins carefully, night after night, the sound of metal clicking together too loud in the silence. Sometimes Sarah would wake and watch from the doorway, seeing worry flicker across her father's face. She didn't understand money, but she understood fear. The land could not be sold. The law said Sarah was too young to decide, so the family was bound to a piece of earth that gave nothing back. To Sarah, the land meant nothing at all. It was just another place adults spoke about in low voices, another word she didn't yet understand. She ran barefoot through dust. She laughed with her siblings. She traced circles in the dirt with a stick and watched the horizon melt into the sky at sunset. She did not know that beneath that same ground, far below the cracked surface and stubborn stone, pressure was building. Ancient seas compressed into darkness. Oil waiting, silent and patient. History, after all, rarely announces itself. Sometimes it hides beneath the poorest land. Sometimes it chooses a child who never asked for it. And sometimes it begins not with triumph, but with a burden no one knows how to carry yet. The law called it a gift. On paper, it looked almost generous. Land, ownership, a future tied to soil rather than chains. But on the ground, where Joseph Rector stood with dust on his boots and worry in his chest, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like a trap. The 160 acres assigned to Sarah lay miles away from their home near Taft, closer to a place called Glenpool. To reach it, Joseph rode out early one morning, following rough paths where fences ended and certainty faded. The land greeted him without kindness. Stone pushed through thin grass. The soil cracked underfoot. No creek cut through it. No shade softened the sun. He stood there a long time, hat in hand, listening to the wind. This was what the government had given his daughter, a child too young to read, now responsible, by law, for land she could not use, sell, or even understand. Ownership without agency, property without power. When Joseph returned home, Rose knew before he spoke. She had learned to read his silence the way others read scripture. "It won't grow anything," he finally said. "And they want taxes on it." Rose nodded slowly. She did not argue. There was no use. In their world, arguing with the law was like arguing with the weather. That night, as the children slept, Joseph unfolded the papers again. Sarah Rector, minor, allottee, Creek freedman. Each word carried weight. Each word felt like it had been chosen by someone who would never sit at their table or count coins by lamplight. $30 a year, that was the price of keeping land that fed no one. At first, Joseph tried to make it work. He cleared brush, patched fences, returned year after year to ground that refused him. Each spring, the tax notice arrived as predictably as the heat. Each year, the burden grew heavier. Sometimes he considered selling. Others did. Neighbors with similar allotments gave up, signing away their land for a few dollars or promises that never came. But when Joseph went to the courthouse, he was met with polite finality. "She's a minor," they said. "The land cannot be sold. It's for her protection." Protection. The word tasted bitter. The same law that claimed to protect Sarah offered no protection from hunger, no relief from debt, no mercy for a family barely holding itself together. It protected the land more than the people standing on it. At home, Sarah noticed changes she could not name. Her father spoke less. His shoulders curved inward as if carrying something invisible. Her mother stretched meals thinner, adding water to soup, saving scraps. Conversations stopped when Sarah entered the room. Adult worries folded themselves into silence. Still, childhood found a way to survive. Sarah chased her siblings through tall grass. She laughed easily, unaware of how rare laughter was becoming inside the house. In the evenings, she sat on the doorstep, watching the sky shift from gold to red to deep blue. She liked the moment when the first stars appeared, quiet, patient, unbothered by human struggle. Sometimes she asked about the land. "What does it mean to own something?" she once asked her father. Joseph looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, carefully, "It means people expect something from you, even when you have nothing to give." She didn't fully understand, but she remembered the tone in his voice. By the time Sarah turned 5, the world beyond Taft was changing. Men in clean coats and polished boots began passing through nearby towns. Wagons loaded with equipment rattled over dirt roads. Words like drilling, leases, and oil drifted into conversations at church and the general store. To the Rectors, those words felt distant, belonging to another world where risk and reward spoke a language they did not know. Oil was something whispered about, not trusted, something that brought outsiders and trouble. But Glenpool was stirring. Joseph heard it first in fragments. A neighbor mentioned test wells. Another spoke of land suddenly worth more than it had ever been. Maps were being redrawn by men who saw the ground not as home, but as opportunity. The same land Joseph had stood on, useless and silent, was now attracting attention. He said nothing to Sarah. To her, life remained simple. Chores, school when possible, Sundays marked by hymns and prayer. She learned to read from worn books and to listen carefully when adults spoke. She learned, without being taught, that security was fragile. The taxes did not stop. One year, Joseph barely made the payment. He sold a mule, took extra work, counted coins until his fingers cramped. Rose watched him with a quiet fear she never spoke aloud. At night, Sarah sometimes woke to the sound of whispering. "What if we lose everything?" "We can't sell. They won't let us." Those words settled into her memory like dust. The land, her land, had become something the family feared. And still, beneath that same barren ground, the earth waited. Pressure built slowly, invisibly, indifferent to law or lineage. Oil did not care who owned the surface. It did not care about race, or poverty, or guardianship. It only waited for the right moment to rise. But no one in that house knew it yet. To them, the allotment was not a miracle waiting to happen. It was a bill, a burden, a silent threat hanging over every season. History was already moving towards Sarah Rector. It just hadn't spoken her name out loud. Yet, By the winter of 1910, the wind in Oklahoma no longer carried only dust. It carried rumors. They moved faster than truth. Whispered at church doors, exchanged at the general store, spoken in half sentences by men who lowered their voices when strangers passed. Oil was being found, not everywhere, but close enough to make land feel dangerous. Glenpool was no longer a forgotten name. Joseph Rector heard it first from a man repairing a fence nearby, then from another who had come back from Muskogee with stories of drilling rigs rising against the horizon like strange metal crosses. Men with maps were arriving. Men who did not ask about families, only boundaries. Land that had once been dismissed was now being reconsidered. Joseph tried not to listen. Hope, he had learned, was expensive, but the taxes did not pause for doubt. That year, the payment loomed larger than ever. $30 again, always $30. The number felt carved into his life. He counted his earnings and knew, before the coins touched the table, that they would not be enough. For the first time, Joseph considered what he had avoided for years, leasing the land. It felt like surrender, not because he believed the land was valuable, but because signing meant letting strangers step onto something that carried his daughter's name. The land might be barren, but it was hers, the last thing the law had given her. Still, hunger has a way of narrowing choices. One cold morning, a man arrived at the rector's door. He wore a clean coat despite the mud and spoke with practiced patience. He said he represented oil interests, perhaps Standard Oil, perhaps an independent broker. It hardly mattered. They all sounded the same to Joseph, confident, certain, unburdened. The man did not promise riches. He promised relief. A lease, he explained, would bring a modest payment up front, enough to cover taxes, enough to buy time. If oil was found, there would be royalties. If not, nothing was lost. Nothing. Joseph listened in silence. Rose stood nearby, her hands folded tight in her apron. Sarah watched from behind her mother, sensing tension without understanding it. "Your daughter's land," the man said, tapping the papers gently, "is unlikely to produce anything, but this way, you won't have to worry anymore." Joseph looked down at the documents. Sarah Rector, minor. The words stared back at him. That night, he did not sleep. He sat at the small table long after the lamp burned low. Papers spread before him like a quiet accusation. Rose joined him without speaking. Outside, the wind pressed against the house, restless and cold. "This isn't about oil," Joseph finally said. "It's about keeping us standing." Rose nodded. She reached for his hand. "At dawn." Joseph signed. The pen scratched slowly across the page. His name came out uneven, as if resisting. When he finished, he felt no relief, only a strange emptiness, as though something invisible had passed out of his reach. The lease payment arrived soon after. It was not much, but it was enough. The tax was paid. The family breathed again. Life went on. Sarah returned to her routines. School when it was available. Chores always. She noticed nothing remarkable about that year. To her, the world remained made of dust, wind, and ordinary days. But far away, in Glenpool, the land remembered. Wooden derricks rose quietly at first, barely visible against the sky. Engines coughed to life. Men worked long hours, their movements steady, methodical. They drilled through stubborn stone, through layers of history pressed tight together. The earth resisted, then gave way. In the spring of 1913, it happened. Those who were there said the ground groaned first, deep and low, like an animal waking after centuries of sleep. Then came the roar. Oil burst upward in a dark column, thick and gleaming, raining back down onto the soil. A gusher. The Glenpool field came alive in a single violent breath. Word spread fast, faster than Joseph could process. Neighbors spoke in disbelief. Men rode hard to town to confirm what they had seen. Newspapers scrambled to keep up, but no one came to the Rector house right away. Sarah did not see the oil. She felt none of the earth's violence beneath her feet. That day, she helped her mother with laundry, scrubbing clothes in cold water until her hands stung. She laughed when her brother splashed her and scolded him for it. History erupted 60 miles away, and she never noticed. It was weeks before a letter arrived. An official envelope, court language, numbers written so neatly they felt unreal. Royalties were owed, not to Joseph, not to Rose, but to Sarah Rector. The figures were staggering. Thousands of dollars, monthly. More than Joseph had earned in his entire life. Joseph read the letter twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something familiar. They did not. That night, the house was quieter than it had ever been. "They say it's hers," Joseph finally said, his voice barely audible. Rose sat very still. Sarah lay awake in her bed, pretending to sleep. She did not understand the words, but she understood the silence that followed them. It felt heavy, like air before a storm. Outside, the wind shifted. It carried something new now, not dust, but the faint metallic scent of oil. A smell sharp and unfamiliar. The smell of change beneath the land that had once been dismissed as worthless. A fortune was rising, and with it, forces far larger than one family. Laws, courts, guardians were already moving into place. Sarah Rector had become rich. She just didn't know it yet, and soon the world would decide what that meant for her. Money does not arrive quietly. It announces itself, first through whispers, then through paperwork, and finally through the law. When the oil began flowing from Sarah Rector's land, it did not take long for the courthouse in Muskogee to notice. Ledgers were updated. Reports were filed. Numbers were reviewed with raised eyebrows and careful hands. A child's name appeared again and again beside sums that did not belong to children. Sarah Rector, minor, Creek Freedman. Oil royalties exceeding expectation. To the court. This was not a miracle. It was a problem. In Oklahoma. The rules were clear. A minor, especially one of native or freedman status, was not considered capable of managing wealth. The law spoke in the language of protection, but beneath that language lived an older belief that certain people were unfit to control power, even when that power carried their name. The solution had a name: guardianship. On paper, it sounded reasonable. A responsible adult would be appointed to manage the child's affairs. Money would be invested wisely. The child's future would be secured. The court would supervise everything. In reality, it meant this: Sarah's fortune would belong to everyone except Sarah. Joseph Rector was summoned to the courthouse on a gray morning that smelled of rain and oil. He wore his best jacket, clean but worn thin at the elbows. He removed his hat before entering, holding it carefully as if it were something fragile. The courtroom was quiet, polite, indifferent. Men sat behind desks polished smooth by years of authority. Their words were measured, their expressions unreadable. They spoke about Sarah as if she were an idea, not a child who chased dust through a yard and slept in a small bed down the road. "For her own good," one of them said. Joseph nodded. He had learned when nodding was safer than speaking. They explained that a guardian would be appointed to oversee Sarah's estate, someone with experience, someone respectable, someone the court trusted. Joseph asked one question. "Will her money help her family?" The answer came gently, but firmly. "The funds are for the child. Not for the parents, not for the household, not for the people who had carried her through hunger and fear. For the child, under supervision." Joseph left the courthouse with a weight in his chest that felt heavier than poverty. He understood then that wealth had not freed them. It had placed them under a brighter light. At home. Rose listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "So we're rich," she said softly, "and still powerless." Within weeks, the decision was finalized. The court appointed T.J. Porter as Sarah's legal guardian. Porter was known in town. White, well-spoken, respectable. A man whose name opened doors and whose presence made judges comfortable. He shook hands firmly and looked people in the eye. He attended church. He owned property. He also now controlled a fortune that would never pass through his hands if not for the law. Porter visited the Rector home shortly after his appointment. He brought gifts. Candy for the children. A doll for Sarah. Small gestures meant to soften the moment. He spoke kindly, using words like responsibility and stability. He assured Joseph and Rose that Sarah's interests would be protected. Sarah watched him closely. She did not yet know what a guardian was, but she knew how her parents' shoulders stiffened when he spoke. She knew the room felt different with him in it, smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer together. That night, Sarah placed the doll on a shelf and did not touch it again. The money began to move. Checks were issued. Accounts were opened. Investments discussed. Numbers that once felt impossible became routine to men who knew how to multiply them. Reports were filed with neat handwriting and careful sums. Everything looked orderly. Yet nothing in the Rector household changed very much. They still lived modestly. Meals were still simple. Rose still mended clothes instead of replacing them. Joseph still worked when he could, his pride bruised but intact. Neighbors began to notice. How could a child earning thousands of dollars each month still live this way? Where was the money going? Who was it really helping? Whispers grew louder. Newspapers caught the scent of contradiction. They loved the story. A poor black child made rich by oil, then kept poor by law. Headlines grew bolder. Language sharpened. Sarah's name traveled far beyond Oklahoma, carried by curiosity and outrage in equal measure. But inside the Rector home, the attention felt unreal. Sarah still went to school, still helped her mother, still sat on the doorstep at dusk watching the sky burn and fade. Yet something had shifted inside her. She felt watched, not by people, but by forces she could not see. One evening, she asked her father a question she had been holding for days. "If the land is mine," she said carefully, "why does everyone else decide what happens?" Joseph did not answer right away. Finally, he said, "Because the law thinks it knows you better than we do." Sarah nodded. She did not fully understand, but she sensed the truth in his voice. Outside, the oil fields continued to hum, a low, endless sound, like breath drawn from the earth itself. Money flowed as steadily as the crude beneath Glenpool, and somewhere between the courthouse and the drilling rigs, A child's life was being shaped by decisions she had never been allowed to make. The law had arrived, and with it, the quiet beginning of a new kind of confinement. The story did not belong to Sarah for very long. It escaped the quiet roads of Taft and traveled by train, by telegraph wire, by ink pressed into paper. It arrived in newsrooms far from Oklahoma, where men leaned back in their chairs and smiled at the contradiction it offered. A child, black, poor, rich beyond imagination. America loved stories like that, especially when they could be told without listening to the person at the center of them. The first articles were cautious, almost curious. Small columns tucked beside grain prices and election notices. Oil discovered on land owned by a Negro child. Unlikely fortune in Glenpool Field. The tone was surprised, not yet cruel. Then the numbers began to circulate. Thousands per month. More than judges, more than senators, more than the president himself. And the language changed. Headlines grew louder, sharper, less careful. The richest Negro girl in the world. They printed Sarah's name as if it were a novelty item, something rare and strange to be examined. They described her home in unnecessary detail, its size, its simplicity, its poverty, as though the contrast itself were the story. They did not describe her voice. They did not ask what she wanted. They did not wait for permission. Reporters began arriving in Taft. They stepped off trains wearing polished shoes unsuited for dust roads. They carried cameras and notebooks, asking directions to the Rector house as if it were a landmark. Neighbors watched from porches as strangers walked past. Curiosity flickering in their eyes, Rose Rector answered the door every time. She learned quickly which smiles were harmless and which carried hunger. She refused photographs, declined interviews. She said Sarah was tired, or studying, or simply unavailable. Most reporters wrote their stories anyway, when facts were missing. They filled the space with imagination. They wrote that Sarah lived in rags. They wrote that her parents were uneducated and careless. They wrote that her guardian controlled everything while the family starved. Some of it was exaggerated. Some of it was uncomfortably close to the truth. Inside the house, the attention felt unreal and invasive. Sarah noticed how her name was spoken differently now, slower, heavier, as if it belonged to something larger than her body. At school, children whispered. Teachers paused when they called her name. She did not feel rich. She felt exposed. One afternoon, a photographer tried to take her picture without asking. Rose stepped between them, her voice calm but firm. The man laughed it off, saying, "It's for history," Rose replied. "Then history can wait." But history never waits. By summer, the story had reached Chicago. There, it landed differently. Black newspapers did not treat Sarah's fortune as a curiosity. They treated it as a warning. Editors at the Chicago Defender read the reports closely. A wealthy black child placed under white guardianship. Parents with no authority. Money managed behind closed doors. They had seen this pattern before. Too many times to ignore it. They began asking questions the other papers did not. Where was the money going? How was the guardian chosen? Why did wealth not translate into security? Letters were sent south, inquiries made, words sharpened into accusation. The name W.E.B. Du Bois entered the conversation. Du Bois had spent his life documenting the quiet machinery of inequality, the systems that did not shout, but worked steadily, efficiently, without apology. When Sarah Rector's case crossed his desk, he recognized it immediately. This was not an anomaly. This was a system functioning exactly as designed. Through the NAACP, an investigation was requested. A man named James C. Waters was sent to Oklahoma, not as a reporter, but as a witness. He arrived without spectacle, no camera, no headlines, just a notebook and time. He spoke with townspeople who hesitated before answering. He examined court records. He traced signatures and numbers. He noted patterns that repeated themselves across counties and cases. Nearly every black child with oil-rich land had a white guardian. Nearly every guardian grew wealthier. Nearly every family remained distant from the money bearing their child's name. When Waters visited the Rector home, he observed more than he asked. The house was modest but clean. The children were cared for. Sarah was quiet, attentive, watchful, not neglected, but not empowered. He wrote later that she seemed aware of her condition without understanding its mechanisms. In other words, she knew something was wrong, but not how to name it. Waters' report traveled north. Du Bois read it slowly. He did not dramatize it. He did not rush. He understood that the most dangerous injustices were the ones that looked reasonable on paper. Guardianship, protection, supervision. Words that hid power behind politeness. He wrote to the governor of Oklahoma. His letter was measured but sharp. He did not accuse individuals. He questioned systems. He asked how a child could be declared wealthy and incapable at the same time. How protection could look so much like exclusion. The letter was published, and suddenly, Sarah Rector was no longer just a headline. She was a symbol. To some Americans, she represented the miracle of opportunity. To others, she represented the lie beneath it. Back in Taft. The noise grew louder. Strangers sent letters addressed simply to Miss Sarah Rector. Some offered advice. Others offered gifts. A few, grown men, offered marriage, as if wealth erased childhood. Rose burned those letters without a word. Sarah did not read them. She sat at the table some evenings while her parents spoke in careful tones. Words like court, investigation. NAACP floated past her. She listened the way she always had, quietly, absorbing more than she showed. One night, she asked her mother, "Why do people who don't know me talk about me so much?" Rose brushed her hair slowly before answering. "Because," she said, "they see your fortune before they see your face." Outside, the oil fields continued their endless work. The earth gave without asking questions. The law continued its own work. Slower, but just as relentless. Sarah lay awake listening to the hum on the horizon, a sound that no longer felt distant. It felt like something following her. The story was no longer about land, or oil, or money. It was about who was allowed to own their own life, and America had not yet decided how to answer that. When the questions grew louder, the courthouse responded the only way it knew how, with paperwork. Judges did not answer to emotion. They answered to procedure. And as letters from Chicago arrived, as editorials questioned the morality of guardianship, officials in Oklahoma closed ranks. They insisted the system was sound, that it had rules, that it protected children like Sarah Rector from exploitation. They spoke as if protection were a favor. In Muskogee, the presiding judge prepared a formal reply to the inquiries sent by W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP. The tone was firm, almost irritated. He rejected accusations of misconduct. He emphasized that guardians were monitored, accounts audited, and the child's interests safeguarded. The problem, he implied, was misunderstanding. Outsiders did not know Oklahoma. They did not understand the complexity of Indian Territory. They did not see the danger of leaving vast sums of money in the hands of people deemed unprepared. The letter concluded with a familiar phrase, "For the child's own good." On paper, everything looked correct. T.J. Porter's reports were immaculate. Income listed, expenses justified, investments explained in clean, precise language, the numbers balanced, the signatures were in place. No laws appeared to be broken. Yet outside the courthouse walls, doubt continued to spread. Neighbors noticed how Porter's life improved. A better carriage, new clothes, invitations to dinners with officials. Respect followed him now. As naturally as oil followed land, the Rectors noticed too, but said nothing. Joseph Rector had learned long ago that open resistance came at a cost his family could not afford. Instead, he carried his anger inward. It settled into his posture, his silence, his health. Sarah watched him change. Her father had always been quiet, but now there was something heavier behind his eyes. He spent long evenings staring at nothing, hands folded as if holding something invisible. When he spoke, his words were careful, measured, chosen as if every sentence might be overheard. The guardian visited less frequently now. When he did, he spoke mostly to Rose and Joseph, rarely addressing Sarah directly. She noticed how conversations stopped when she entered the room, how adults spoke about her future as if she were not sitting there, listening. One afternoon, Sarah overheard a conversation she was not meant to hear. Porter was explaining an investment strategy: bonds, property, long-term growth. He spoke confidently, assured that the court would approve his decisions. Joseph asked quietly whether some of the money might be used for better schooling. Porter paused. "That can be discussed," he said. "In time?" Time, Sarah would learn, was another word for control. Outside the Rector home, the headlines continued to evolve. What began as curiosity turned into criticism, then into suspicion. Articles questioned whether guardianship was merely a legal form of theft, whether black wealth was being quietly siphoned into white hands under the banner of protection. The language grew sharper. So did the resistance. White officials accused Northern newspapers of stirring racial tension, of exploiting a child's story for political gain. They insisted that Oklahoma was being unfairly portrayed, behind closed doors. Judges reassured one another that if they conceded even one case, the entire system might come under scrutiny. They could not allow that. Sarah, meanwhile, lived in the space between narratives, to the world. She was a symbol. To the court, she was a case file. To her family, she was a child trying to understand why her name carried so much weight. At night, she lay awake, listening to the familiar hum of the oil fields. The sound was constant now, impossible to ignore. It had become part of the landscape, part of her dreams. Sometimes she imagined the oil as something alive, flowing endlessly beneath the ground, obedient to no one. She wondered why something so powerful could be controlled by so many rules. One evening, she asked her mother a question that startled her. "When I grow up," Sarah said, "will they still decide for me?" Rose hesitated before answering. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know this. Nothing scares people more than a black woman who owns her own future." Sarah did not fully understand the words, but she felt their truth settle inside her. The tension reached a quiet breaking point when the NAACP formally requested a broader investigation into guardianship practices across Oklahoma. Not just Sarah's case, but all of them. The request did not carry legal force, but it carried attention. And attention, for a system built on silence, was dangerous. Judges responded defensively. They doubled down on procedure. They released statements. They reaffirmed their authority, publicly. Nothing changed. Privately, lines were being drawn. Porter became more cautious. His reports more detailed. His visits more controlled. He understood now that he was being watched, not just by the court, but by history. The Rectors felt the pressure too. Letters arrived daily, some supportive, some threatening, some simply curious. Rose filtered them quietly. Joseph avoided town when he could. Sarah learned to walk with her eyes lowered, not from shame, but from exhaustion. She was tired of being looked at. One afternoon, as Sarah sat on the porch tracing lines in the dust with a stick, she realized something that would stay with her forever. The money did not belong to her life. Her life belonged to the money. It determined where she could go, who could speak for her, what the law expected of her. And yet, she had never agreed to any of it. The guardianship system called itself protection. But protection, Sarah was beginning to understand, could also be a kind of cage, one built carefully, legally, and with the full approval of the state. The oil continued to rise, the courts continued to insist, and the child at the center of it all continued to wait for someone, somewhere, to decide whether she would ever be more than a name on a page. By 1914, the numbers stopped making sense. They no longer sounded like money. They sounded like mythology. Reports filed with the court showed Sarah Rector's income rising month after month, $10,000, then more. Oil flowed steadily from her land in Glenpool, feeding pipelines, rail cars, and refineries that carried its value far beyond Oklahoma. To bankers, it was a triumph. To oilmen, it was luck. To the court, it was a responsibility. To the public, it was irresistible. Newspapers began to repeat the same phrase until it hardened into truth. The richest Negro child in America. Sometimes they softened it, sometimes they sharpened it, but the message remained the same. A child, black, wealthy beyond imagination. The phrase traveled faster than any correction could follow. It was spoken in barber shops and train cars, printed beside photographs taken without permission, retold with embellishment and disbelief. For many readers, the story confirmed something they already believed, that wealth, when it appeared in the wrong place, must be temporary, supervised, explained away. Sarah did not read the papers, but she felt their presence everywhere. People stared longer now. Strangers smiled too easily. Adults spoke her name with a tone that mixed admiration and suspicion, as if expecting her to say something extraordinary at any moment. She did not. She was still a child who preferred quiet corners and familiar routines. She still helped her mother sweep the porch, still walked to school with her books held close to her chest, still listened more than she spoke. Yet danger had begun to orbit her life. Letters arrived daily, some praising her, others pleading. A few were unsettling. Men she had never met wrote as though they knew her, addressing her with intimacy she had never offered. Some asked for money, others for favor. A few proposed marriage, ignoring entirely the fact that she was still a child. Rose burned those letters without ceremony. Joseph grew increasingly uneasy. Wealth had brought attention, and attention had brought risk. He worried about strangers, about rumors, about the way people began to talk as if Sarah were an object, something to be claimed, managed, protected, or taken. The court worried too, not about Sarah's safety, but about control. A child with that level of income posed a problem no statute had anticipated fully. The guardianship system had been designed to manage modest estates, not fortunes that rivaled industrialists. Judges met privately to discuss procedures. New restrictions were quietly enforced. Sarah's movements were monitored more closely, her schooling discussed in legal terms, her future mapped by people who had never asked her what she wanted. The guardian, T.J. Porter, adapted quickly. He expanded investments, diversified holdings, purchased property in Sarah's name. Every decision carried his signature. Every report reinforced his authority. On paper, he was doing everything right. But power has a way of revealing itself in small things. Porter decided when Sarah could travel, which letters reached her parents, what information the family was allowed to see. He did not need to be cruel. The system did the work for him. In town, people spoke of Sarah in extremes. Some called her blessed, Others called her cursed. There were rumors of kidnapping plots, never proven, but persistent enough to shape behavior. Teachers were warned, doors were locked more carefully at night. Rose no longer let Sarah wander far from home. Sarah sensed the fear growing around her like a second skin. One afternoon, she asked her father why everyone seemed afraid. "Because," Joseph said slowly, "money makes people imagine things." "About me?" "About themselves," he replied. As her income grew, comparisons began appearing in print. They said she earned more than the President of the United States, more than senators who passed laws that governed her life, more than judges who claimed to protect her. The irony was never lost on those who looked closely. A child richer than the men who controlled her. The NAACP watched carefully. Du Bois understood that this was the moment when the story could no longer be ignored. Wealth on this scale exposed the guardianship system in a way no argument ever could. It forced the country to confront a question it preferred to avoid. What happens when Black success cannot be dismissed as temporary? Investigations continued quietly. Letters were written. Pressure built. Not enough to break the system, but enough to make it uneasy. Back in Oklahoma, officials reassured the public that everything was under control, that Sarah was well cared for, that her fortune was secure. They never said whose control they meant. Sarah herself began to feel the distance between her name and her life widen. She heard adults speak about her future as if it were already decided. Schools chosen, investments planned, possibilities narrowed to what felt acceptable to others. At night, she dreamed of the land at Glen Pool, not as a place of wealth, but as an open field under a wide sky. She imagined standing there alone, listening to the earth breathe, free from rules and ledgers. She woke each time to the same truth. Her fortune was growing. Her freedom was not. The title they had given her, the richest child in America, felt less like an honor and more like a warning. It marked her, isolated her, made her visible in ways she could not control. And as the oil continued to flow, as the money continued to accumulate, forces beyond her family began to circle more closely. Because in America, wealth has never been just about money. It has always been about power. And Sarah Rector was standing at the center of something far larger than herself, whether she wanted to be or not. Wealth attracts attention. Too much attention attracts danger. By late 1914, the conversations around Sarah Rector had changed tone. What once sounded like curiosity now carried something sharper underneath. Envy, fixation, calculation. Her name no longer belonged only to newspapers or court documents. It circulated in places where law did not reach easily. People began to speculate openly. How much did the child really earn? Where did she live? Who watched her? Questions like those did not remain harmless for long. The first warning came quietly. A neighbor mentioned overhearing men in town talking about the oil girl. The second came through a letter, unsigned, careless in its wording, hinting that wealth like Sarah's made people reckless. By the third, Joseph no longer dismissed the fear. There were rumors of kidnapping. No one could prove them. No plan was uncovered. No crime attempted. But the danger did not need proof to be real. It lived in the uncertainty, in the way strangers lingered too long near the house, in the sudden interest people took in Sarah's routines. Rose began locking doors earlier. Curtains stayed drawn. Sarah was no longer allowed to walk alone. Even daylight felt exposed. Sarah noticed the shift immediately. Her world grew smaller. Paths she once walked freely were now forbidden. Friends were kept at a distance. Adults spoke in lowered voices, stopping abruptly when she entered the room. Fear wrapped itself around her life with a careful, suffocating patience. She asked her mother one evening why she couldn't go outside. Rose answered honestly, "Because the world has decided you're valuable." Sarah frowned. "I was always here," she said. "Why now?" Rose had no answer that would not break something. The court reacted faster than the family. To officials, rumors were not emotional, they were logistical. A wealthy minor facing potential danger was a liability. Protection required distance, control required removal. Discussions began quietly. Sarah's presence in Oklahoma had become inconvenient. The oil fields were too close, the press too curious, the people too unpredictable. A solution emerged that sounded reasonable enough to be approved without protest. Send her away. Not permanently, just far enough to remove the immediate risk. Somewhere controlled, somewhere respectable, somewhere that would look good in court records. The name came easily. Tuskegee Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington. Tuskegee was known as a place of discipline, order, and moral education for Black youth. It carried prestige. It offered safety behind gates and supervision. And, most importantly, it removed Sarah from Oklahoma without appearing punitive. The Guardian approved the plan. The court endorsed it. The decision was presented as an opportunity. Sarah was not asked. When she was told, she listened quietly. She did not cry. She did not protest. She had learned by then that decisions about her life were rarely conversations. Her mother packed her clothes carefully, folding each piece with deliberate calm. Her father said little, but his hands trembled slightly when he buttoned her coat. On the morning she left, the air smelled of damp earth and oil. The train waited at the station. Iron and smoke and noise, everything Sarah disliked about change. Rose hugged her tightly. "Remember who you are," she whispered. "Not what they call you." Sarah nodded. As the train pulled away, Oklahoma stretched out behind her, red dirt fading into distance. The hum of oil fields replaced by the rhythm of steel wheels on track. She pressed her face to the window, watching her world recede. She felt neither excitement nor fear, only separation. Tuskegee was different from anything she had known. The campus was orderly, clean, enclosed. Brick buildings stood in careful rows. Bells marked time. Rules governed movement. There was safety in its structure, but also silence. For the first time in years, Sarah was not the center of attention. Here, she was simply another student. No reporters, no strangers, no whispered calculations. She attended classes, learned arithmetic beyond counting, learned to write clearly, to speak with confidence when required. Her days were filled with routine, her nights with quiet, yet the distance did not sever her from her fortune. Letters still arrived, reports still moved between offices, money still flowed from land she had not seen in years. Even here. The Guardian's name appeared on documents she never touched. Her wealth followed her like a shadow. At Tuskegee, Sarah began to understand something she had never been taught directly. Money did not equal freedom. If anything, it had done the opposite. It had dictated where she lived, who decided for her, how much of herself she was allowed to show. Some nights, lying in her narrow bed, she thought about Glenpool, about the land she barely remembered, about how something beneath it had changed her life without ever asking permission. She wondered if the oil still roared the way people said it did. She wondered if the earth ever felt owned, far away, in Oklahoma. Officials congratulated themselves. The risk was reduced. The problem relocated. The system remained intact. Sarah Rector was safe, contained, and learning, slowly, quietly, what it meant to grow up inside a fortune she did not control. Tuskegee did not feel like exile. That was what made it dangerous. It was quiet in ways Oklahoma had never been. Orderly, predictable. Bells rang on schedule. Lights went out at the same hour each night. The world here moved with intention, not accident, for the first time since her name had begun to travel without her. Sarah Rector could breathe without being watched. No one whispered when she walked past. No one stared at her hands as if expecting gold to spill from them. No one called her rich. At Tuskegee, she was simply Sarah. She learned quickly. Numbers made sense to her in ways they never had before. Arithmetic was no longer just counting coins. It was structure, logic, cause and effect. Words became tools rather than mysteries. She learned to write carefully, to shape sentences that said exactly what she meant in class. Teachers spoke of discipline and self-reliance. They taught that knowledge was a form of armor, that dignity could be built, piece by piece, through effort and restraint. Sarah listened closely. But there was something they did not teach. They did not teach what to do when discipline was used against you. They did not teach how to live inside a system that praised you while limiting you. Letters from home arrived on a regular schedule. Her mother wrote about small things: weather, neighbors, the condition of the garden. Her father wrote less. But when he did, his words were careful, deliberate, as if each sentence had passed through several unseen filters. He never wrote about money. Sarah noticed that. She also noticed what was missing from the reports sent to Tuskegee. Statements arrived detailing her income, investments, holdings, always addressed to the guardian, never to her. She was copied on nothing, consulted on nothing. Even here, education had limits. One afternoon, while helping a younger student with arithmetic, Sarah realized something unsettling. She could calculate interest. She could understand growth. She could explain how wealth multiplied. Yet she could not access her own. The contradiction lodged itself deep inside her. That evening, she wrote a question in her notebook, not addressed to anyone, just written and underlined. What does it mean to own something if you cannot decide what happens to it? She did not yet know that this question would shape the rest of her life. At Tuskegee, time passed differently. Days folded into weeks, weeks into seasons. Sarah grew taller. Her voice steadied. She began to speak when spoken to, not eagerly, but with quiet confidence. Teachers noticed her composure, her restraint. She was not disruptive, not dramatic. She carried herself as if aware that too much emotion could be misinterpreted. She was learning caution. Meanwhile, outside the campus gates, the world continued to debate her existence. Newspapers returned to her story now and then. Though the headlines were less sensational, the novelty had faded. New scandals had taken its place. Sarah Rector became a reference rather than a focus, a case mentioned in discussions of guardianship and race, a footnote in arguments about fairness, but footnotes still shape narratives. The NAACP continued its work quietly. Investigations expanded, other cases emerged. Patterns confirmed what Du Bois had suspected all along. Sarah's situation was not exceptional, it was typical. Her wealth had not exposed a flaw in the system, it had illuminated its purpose. Back at Tuskegee, Sarah felt the distance from Oklahoma sharpen into clarity. For the first time, she could see her life not as something happening to her, but as something designed around her. Decisions had been made early, paths narrowed before she could walk them. She was safe. She was educated. She was constrained. One night, after lights out, Sarah sat by the window watching the campus settle into darkness. The air smelled of pine and earth, different from the oil-scented wind of home, but grounding in its own way. She thought of Glenpool, not the money, not the oil, but the land itself. She remembered standing barefoot on dirt she had been told was hers, dirt that had felt no different beneath her feet than any other ground. The land had not changed her. People had. She understood then that wealth was not the cage. Fear was. Fear of what she represented. Fear of what she might become. Fear of a black girl whose name carried power no one had planned for. Sarah closed her notebook and made a decision she would never say out loud. She would learn everything she could. If the law insisted on speaking for her, she would learn its language. If money dictated her life, she would understand how it moved. If silence was expected of her, she would master when to use it and when to break it. For now, she waited. Not passively, strategically. The oil continued to flow. The courts continued to manage. The guardian continued to sign. And Sarah Rector continued to grow. Not into the symbol they had created, but into someone capable of outlasting it. By the time Sarah Rector turned 13, her fortune had reached a level that no one had anticipated and no one fully understood. The oil beneath Glenpool showed no sign of slowing. Month after month, barrels were drawn from the earth, refined, sold, and converted into numbers that grew so large they stopped feeling real. Court documents listed her income in neat columns, figures that dwarfed the annual salaries of governors, judges, and industrial managers alike. On paper, Sarah Rector was no longer just wealthy. She was powerful. But power, when it is not held, becomes something else entirely. In Oklahoma, officials spoke of her case with cautious pride. They cited it as evidence that the system worked, that opportunity could exist even for those at the margins. They pointed to the careful management of her estate, the detailed reports, the steady growth. What they did not say was that every ounce of that power flowed through hands that were not hers. The guardian's authority expanded naturally, almost invisibly. T.J. Muz. Porter now managed more than money. He managed perception. He decided which schools were appropriate, which opportunities were premature, which decisions could wait. He spoke often of responsibility, of long-term planning, of protecting Sarah from herself. Sarah heard about these conversations only indirectly. At Tuskegee, she received updates stripped of emotion. The language was always neutral, always calm. Growth, stability, security. Yet something had changed inside her. She was no longer just absorbing information. She was evaluating it. In class, she learns about contracts and obligations, about ownership and stewardship, about how institutions justified control by claiming benevolence. She listened not as a student, but as someone whose life had been shaped by those exact principles. One afternoon, a teacher spoke of the importance of trusteeship, how certain people were entrusted to act on behalf of others for the greater good. Sarah raised her hand. "What happens?" she asked carefully. "When the person being protected never gets to speak?" The room fell quiet. The teacher answered diplomatically. "Systems," he said, "were imperfect but necessary. Order required hierarchy. Experience required time." Sarah nodded, but the answer stayed with her, unresolved. Meanwhile, back in Oklahoma, attention returned, not from newspapers, but from institutions. Banks noticed, investors noticed. The scale of Sarah's holdings made her estate impossible to ignore. Invitations arrived for Porter. Meetings, partnerships, discussions framed as opportunities for growth. Each one reinforced the same truth. Sarah's name opened doors. Porter walked through them. The NAACP continued to press quietly, but momentum had slowed. The country was changing focus. New conflicts, new distractions. Sarah's case remained important, but no longer urgent. And urgency, she was learning, was the only language power truly listened to at Tuskegee. Sarah began to stand out, not for her wealth, but for her restraint. She spoke rarely, but when she did, people listened. She had developed a habit of watching before acting, of understanding the room before entering it. Her classmates saw her as composed, mature beyond her years. They did not see the calculations running beneath the surface, in private moments. Sarah thought about control, not the control others exercised over her, but the kind she might one day claim for herself. She understood now that the law did not move because it was right. It moved because it was pressured. That wealth did not grant freedom by default. It created leverage, but only for those allowed to use it. She wondered when, if ever, that leverage would be hers. Letters from home grew more optimistic. Joseph wrote that their house was larger now, that life was more comfortable, that people treated them differently. Respect, he implied, had followed money at a distance, but Sarah noticed what he did not write. He did not write that they were free. She returned home briefly during a break. Stepping once more onto Oklahoma soil, the land smelled the same. Dust and oil mingled together. The house was improved, but the atmosphere was careful, as if everyone were aware of unseen boundaries. Porter visited during her stay. He spoke to her directly now. For the first time in years, he praised her education, her discipline. He told her she was doing well. "You have a bright future," he said. "We're making sure of it." Sarah thanked him politely, but inside, something hardened. She realized then that everyone around her spoke of her future as something being prepared, not chosen, a destination arranged by others, waiting for her to arrive. That night, she lay awake listening to the distant hum of oil fields she could not see. She understood something clearly for the first time. Her fortune had reached its peak, but her life had not, and the longer she remained silent, the more permanent the arrangements around her would become. Sarah Rector was no longer a child unaware of her power. She was a young woman beginning to recognize that the greatest struggle ahead would not be to earn freedom, but to reclaim it from those who believed they had earned the right to decide for her. Power does not always announce itself with force. Sometimes, it resists quietly. Sarah Rector began to understand this during her second year away from Oklahoma. When the distance between who she was becoming and what had been decided for her grew impossible to ignore. There was no single moment of rebellion, no argument, no raised voice. There was only awareness. At Tuskegee, Sarah's education had sharpened her attention to structure. She noticed how authority moved, not through commands, but through assumptions. Who spoke first? Who approved? Who was expected to wait? She saw it in classrooms, in meetings, in the careful way adults spoke around her without ever fully addressing her. The same pattern repeated everywhere. Those who controlled resources spoke of responsibility. Those without control were told to be patient. Sarah was praised constantly for her maturity, for her restraint, for not causing trouble. The compliments followed her like a shadow, gentle but binding. She began to suspect they were not meant to encourage her, but to contain her. Letters from the Guardian arrived periodically, written in a tone that suggested partnership while maintaining distance. He updated her on investments, acquisitions, long-term strategies. Each letter ended with the same reassurance. Everything is being handled. Sarah read those words carefully each time. They did not say with you. They did not say for you. They said without you, one evening, after a lecture on civic duty and self-improvement. Sarah stayed behind to speak with the teacher she trusted. She asked questions framed carefully, avoiding accusation. "What happens," she asked, "when someone's life is managed so well that they never get to make mistakes?" The teacher paused. "Mistakes," he said slowly, "are how freedom is tested." Sarah thanked him and left. That night, she wrote another question in her notebook. "Who decides when I am ready?" Back in Oklahoma, the system continued its work uninterrupted. Porter's authority was no longer questioned openly. The NAACP's pressure had faded into background noise. Court records showed no irregularities. Audits found nothing actionable. The story of Sarah Rector had settled into something officials could live with. A success. They said, a protected asset. Sarah felt the weight of that word. Asset. During her next visit home, she noticed how carefully everyone moved around the subject of her future. Her parents avoided asking questions they were no longer allowed to ask. Porter spoke confidently, assuming agreement where none had been offered. One afternoon, while seated at the dining table, Sarah asked him something directly for the first time. "When I turn 18? She said calmly. "What happens then?" The room went still. Porter smiled, a practiced expression, reassuring and controlled. "That's a long way off," he said. "There's no need to worry about that now." Sarah met his eyes. "I'm not worried," she replied. "I want to understand." He shifted slightly in his chair. "When the time comes," he said, "the court will decide what's appropriate." The word landed heavily. Decide. Sarah nodded, thanked him, and said nothing more. But something had changed. For the first time, she understood clearly that silence was not neutrality. It was participation. Every moment she remained quiet allowed others to continue shaping her life without resistance. She did not intend to shout. She intended to wait, strategically, at Tuskegee. Sarah began paying closer attention to legal language. She studied how contracts were written, how authority was justified, how rights were delayed without being denied. She learned that systems rarely said no outright. They said not yet. And not yet, she realized, could last forever. Her classmates spoke of dreams, careers, families, futures they imagined freely. Sarah listened with a mixture of admiration and distance. Her dreams existed, but they felt conditional, tethered to approval she did not control. Still, she did not despair. She had learned patience from her parents, from the land, from years spent waiting for answers that did not come. She began to prepare quietly, to understand money not as wealth, but as leverage, to understand law not as justice, but as language, to understand silence not as weakness, but as timing. The oil continued to flow. Porter continued to manage. The court continued to approve, and Sarah Rector continued to grow. Not outwardly rebellious, not visibly defiant, but increasingly aware that the moment would come when she would no longer ask permission to exist inside her own life. For now, she observed, she learned, and she waited for the day when patience would no longer be the virtue expected of her, but the strength that carried her beyond their reach. There comes a point when waiting stops being patience and starts becoming surrender. Sarah Rector did not know the exact day it happened. There was no dramatic revelation, no single conversation that unlocked the truth. Instead, the realization arrived gradually, settling into her like a second spine, quiet, steady, impossible to ignore. She was no longer confused about her situation. She was clear. At Tuskegee, she had learned how systems spoke when they did not want to give answers. She recognized the careful language, the endless postponement, the comforting phrases that promised a future while denying the present. When the time comes, for your own good, the court will decide. Each phrase now sounded less like protection and more like a boundary marker. Sarah understood something essential. No one was waiting for her to be ready. They were waiting for her to remain compliant. That realization did not make her angry. It made her precise. She began to revisit every memory with new understanding. Her father counting coins by lamplight, her mother burning letters without comment. The way adults had always spoken around her, never to her. It had never been about her age. It had been about her position. In Oklahoma, oil still surged from the land that carried her name. The fortune had plateaued, but it remained enormous, more than enough to shape futures, influence institutions, command respect. Yet none of that power reached her hands. Sarah saw now that the guardianship had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had prevented chaos. Yes, but it had also prevented ownership in the truest sense. It had turned her into a permanent minor, regardless of her intelligence, her education, or her awareness. She was expected to wait quietly until adulthood arrived like permission. But adulthood, she realized, was not a moment. It was a negotiation. During a civics lesson one afternoon, a discussion turned to rights. How they were defined, how they were defended. A classmate asked whether rights were inherent or granted. The teacher hesitated before answering. Rights, he said, exist when society agrees to recognize them. Sarah wrote that sentence down. She underlined it twice. That evening, she added a note beneath it. Then, recognition is power. From that point forward, her silence changed. It was no longer absence. It was strategy. She stopped asking questions that would be dismissed. Instead, she listened for patterns. She learned which words made adults uncomfortable, which subjects caused meetings to end early, which phrases were used to close conversations without resolution. She noticed that no one ever said she would control her fortune, only that she would benefit from it. That distinction mattered. During her next visit home, Sarah watched Porter closely. She listened not to what he said, but to how he said it, where certainty ended and assumption began. When he spoke of her future, he spoke as though it were already mapped. When he spoke of responsibility, he spoke as though it were already his. Sarah did not challenge him. She thanked him politely. She asked neutral questions. She made no demands. And that unsettled him. Because silence that understands is far more dangerous than silence that obeys. Porter sensed the shift, though he could not name it. He began offering reassurances more frequently, explaining decisions that had never been explained before. His tone grew defensive without accusation. Sarah said nothing. Back at Tuskegee, she began preparing in ways no one noticed. She read legal texts not assigned to her. She practiced explaining her thoughts clearly. Without emotion, she learned the art of asking questions that forced answers without appearing confrontational. She understood now that when the moment came, she would not need to raise her voice. She would need to be undeniable. One night, lying awake as the campus settled into darkness, Sarah thought again of the land. She no longer imagined it as something she owned. She imagined it as something that remembered. The earth had waited centuries to release its wealth. It had not rushed. It had not demanded recognition. When the moment was right, it had erupted with unstoppable force. Sarah smiled faintly at the thought. Patience, she realized, was not passive. It was preparation. She did not know when her moment would come. She did not know what form it would take, but she knew this with certainty. When she finally spoke, not as a child, not as a symbol, but as herself, The system that had relied on her silence would not know how to answer. The guardianship had shaped her life, but it had also sharpened her. And that, more than oil or money, was the inheritance no one had planned for. Power does not arrive all at once. It reveals itself in fragments. Moments when the balance shifts just enough for someone to feel it. For Sarah Rector, that moment came not with a confrontation, but with clarity. She was no longer simply being managed. She was being anticipated at Tuskegee. The letters from Oklahoma began to change in tone. Where they once assumed her silence, they now carried explanations. Where decisions were once announced, they were now justified. The Guardian wrote more frequently, not because the law required it, but because uncertainty had entered the relationship. Sarah noticed it immediately. He explained investments she had never questioned. He reassured her of outcomes she had never challenged. He emphasized protection, responsibility, patience, words meant to soothe, but now betraying caution. She read every letter carefully, not for information, but for intent, power. She was learning, revealed itself in defensiveness. She began to understand the true shape of her position. The court controlled the legal structure. The Guardian controlled execution. But she controlled the narrative that made both legitimate. Her silence had been the system's greatest asset. Her awareness was becoming its risk. Sarah did not announce this understanding. She carried it quietly, the way she carried everything that mattered. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer waiting to be granted control. She was waiting to decide how to claim it, back home. Joseph Rector sensed the change even before Sarah spoke of it, when she returned during school breaks. She moved differently, less tentative, more observant. She listened not as a child seeking reassurance, but as someone measuring the room. One evening, as they sat together after supper, Joseph spoke carefully. "You don't ask questions the way you used to," he said. Sarah smiled faintly. "I ask them later," she replied. He nodded, understanding more than she realized. Joseph had spent his life navigating systems designed to ignore him. He recognized the look in his daughter's eyes, the look of someone who had stopped hoping the rules would change and started learning how they worked. Meanwhile, outside their home, the world continued to speak about Sarah. Her name appeared in legal discussions, academic debates, editorials on race and wealth. She had become an example, sometimes celebrated, sometimes weaponized. Few ever asked what it felt like to be that example. Sarah felt it as distance. She existed in documents, in arguments, in assumptions, but rarely in conversations. Decisions continued to be made on her behalf, but now those decisions felt provisional, as if waiting for her response. That, she understood, was leverage at Tuskegee. She refined her understanding further. She learned that institutions rarely collapsed from direct attack. They shifted under pressure applied patiently, strategically, at points where legitimacy mattered. She noticed how much the guardianship relied on appearing benevolent, how much the court relied on appearing orderly, how much the entire structure relied on her cooperation. She had no intention of offering resistance that could be dismissed as emotional or reckless. She would offer something far more dangerous: competence. During a meeting with school administrators, Sarah was asked about her future plans. It was a routine question, asked politely, without expectation of complexity. She answered calmly, "I intend to understand every decision made in my name." The room fell quiet for a moment. No one objected. No one disagreed. But something shifted. From that point forward, people spoke to her more carefully, not because she had demanded authority, but because she had signaled readiness. The Guardian sensed it too. In his next letter, he mentioned the court's timeline. the age at which certain controls would be reconsidered, the importance of a smooth transition. Transition. Sarah underlined the word. She was not being prepared for freedom. She was being prepared to inherit a system that had excluded her. She closed the letter and placed it beside her notebook. That night, she wrote only one sentence. They think time belongs to them. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, steady and indifferent. Far away, the oil fields continued their endless labor, drawing wealth from the earth without pause. Sarah thought again of the land, how it had waited silently until the moment came to rise. She understood now that power did not come from urgency. It came from inevitability. The system would not fall because she opposed it. It would change because it could no longer justify ignoring her. And when that moment arrived, she would not need to shout. She would only need to speak. The first real challenge did not sound like rebellion. It sounded like a question. Sarah Rector learned quickly that systems were trained to absorb noise. Anger could be dismissed. Emotion could be reframed. Even protest could be redirected into procedure. But questions, precise, informed, calmly delivered, had a way of unsettling people who believed authority flowed in only one direction. Her opportunity came quietly. A meeting had been arranged during one of her visits home. Nothing formal, nothing dramatic. Just a discussion, as it was described, about her education and long-term planning. The guardian would be present. A representative of the court would listen. Her parents were invited, but not expected to speak. Sarah understood the choreography immediately. She was meant to sit, listen, and agree. The room was neat and orderly, papers stacked, chairs aligned, authority arranged in a way that made itself visible without ever naming itself. T.J. Porter began the conversation with confidence. He spoke of her progress at Tuskegee, of her discipline, of how well the arrangement had served everyone involved. His tone was congratulatory, almost paternal. Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a pause, brief, but intentional. The kind of pause designed to move the meeting forward without complication. Sarah did not let it. "I have a question," she said. Her voice was steady, not loud, not hesitant. Porter smiled, the way people do when they expect something harmless. "Of course." She did not look at him immediately. She looked at the papers on the table, the documents that carried her name in bold print. "How much money," she asked, "has been earned in my name since the guardianship began?" The question was simple, too simple. Porter hesitated. Not long, but long enough. "The figures are outlined in the reports," he replied. "I've read them." Sarah said, "I'm asking for a total—" Silence settled over the room. The court representative shifted slightly in his chair. Porter cleared his throat. "That's a substantial amount," he said. "The precise total isn't necessary for— It's necessary for me." Sarah interrupted gently. Her father's hands tightened on his knees. Her mother remained still, eyes fixed forward. Porter adjusted his posture. "Sarah," he said, "these matters are complex. The court has determined—" "I understand the court's role," she said. "I want to understand mine." The word mine hung in the air. No one spoke for a moment. This was not defiance. This was not accusation. This was competence asserting itself. The court representative finally spoke. "The guardianship exists to protect your interests," he said carefully, "until you reach legal maturity." Sarah nodded. "And what determines maturity?" she asked. The man paused. "The law." And who decides when the law should change? She continued. Another pause. These are not questions for this meeting, Porter said, his tone tightening. Sarah turned to him. Then when are they questions? She asked. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. This was no longer a child asking for reassurance. This was a young woman identifying the limits of authority. Porter tried to reassert control. You're doing very well, he said. There's no reason to rush these things. Everything is being handled responsibly. Sarah met his gaze. I don't doubt that, she said. I want to learn how. The meeting ended shortly after. No decisions were changed. No declarations were made. But the atmosphere had altered for the first time. The system had been required to respond, not to outrage, but to understanding. Later that evening, Joseph spoke quietly to his daughter. You made them uncomfortable, he said. Sarah nodded. I meant to. He studied her for a long moment. Be careful, he said. They don't like that. I know, she replied. That's how I know it matters. From that day forward, the tone of communication shifted again. Letters from the guardian became more formal, more cautious. Explanations grew longer. Decisions were framed with increasing care. The court did not resist her directly. It recalibrated. Sarah noticed meetings were now scheduled with her rather than around her. She was asked, not consulted, but asked, about preferences, about schooling, about travel. Small things, but power rarely changes all at once. At Tuskegee, she reflected on what had happened. She understood now that the system's strength came from predictability. It expected compliance. It expected gratitude. It expected time to wear down curiosity. What it did not expect was a child who had learned to read the fine print of her own life. Sarah did not mistake this moment for victory. She knew better. The system would adapt. It always did. It would attempt to absorb her questions, to fold them into procedure, to delay them until they lost urgency. But something irreversible had occurred. She had spoken, and the system had listened. Not because it wanted to, but because it had to. That night, Sarah wrote in her notebook again. The first question is never the most important. It's the one that proves you are allowed to ask. She closed the notebook and lay back, listening to the familiar hum of distant oil fields carried faintly on the wind. For years, that sound had meant wealth without agency. Now, it sounded like momentum, slow, heavy, unstoppable. The system did not strike back. That was the first thing Sarah noticed. There were no threats, no raised voices, no sudden punishments. Instead, everything became slower, more careful, more distant. Power. She was learning, rarely responded with force when it could respond with delay. After the meeting, weeks passed without incident. Life at Tuskegee returned to its familiar rhythm. Classes, bells, study hours, quiet evenings. On the surface, nothing had changed. But underneath, the atmosphere had shifted. Letters from Oklahoma arrived less frequently. When they did, they were shorter, less explanatory. The warmth that had crept into the guardian's tone disappeared, replaced by neutrality that felt deliberate. The court had not denied her questions. It had postponed them. Sarah felt the difference immediately. Requests that once received prompt replies were now acknowledged and deferred. Meetings were discussed but not scheduled. Decisions were framed as under review. The message was subtle but unmistakable. You may speak, but we decide when to answer. At first, the delay unsettled her. She wondered if she had miscalculated, if she had moved too soon. If the system would quietly reassert itself by reminding her how little control she truly had, then she understood something crucial. Delay was not confidence. Delay was discomfort. They were buying time, not for her benefit, but for theirs, back home. Joseph felt it too. Officials who once greeted him politely now kept conversations brief. Neighbors grew cautious, unsure whether to treat the Rectors as beneficiaries or liabilities. Respect, he realized, was conditional and easily withdrawn. One afternoon, a friend pulled him aside. "They don't like that she's asking questions," the man said quietly. Joseph nodded. "She's always been listening," he replied. "Now she's speaking." At Tuskegee, Sarah noticed changes in how administrators interacted with her. Nothing overt, just a slight formality where familiarity had once existed, a careful distance. As if everyone were waiting to see what she would do next, she felt the pressure, not as fear, but as expectation. The system was watching her, measuring whether her curiosity would fade, whether her resolve would soften. It expected fatigue, compliance, gratitude. She gave it none of those. Instead, she focused on preparation. She studied financial records more closely, learning to spot patterns in investments and expenditures. She practiced articulating her thoughts with precision, stripping emotion from language until only clarity remained. She understood now that authority responded best to inevitability. One evening, Sarah received a letter from the guardian unlike any before it. It was polite, formal, and unmistakably defensive. He reminded her of the generosity that had allowed her education, of the protection that had shielded her from danger, of the patience the court had shown in accommodating her questions. Then came the line that mattered. "These arrangements have worked well for everyone involved." Sarah read that sentence several times. Everyone, not her parents, not her community, not even herself. Everyone who benefited from her silence. She folded the letter carefully and placed it beside her notebook. That night, she did not write. She sat by the window, watching the campus settle into darkness, listening to the steady hum of life moving forward without her consent. For the first time since she had begun asking questions, doubt surfaced. Not about whether she was right, but about whether the cost would be worth it. She thought of her parents, the quiet sacrifices they had made, the safety the guardianship had promised, the risk of provoking a system that had never needed her approval. Then she thought of the alternative, a lifetime of being managed, a fortune she never truly owned, a voice used only when permitted. The doubt dissolved. The cost, she realized, was already being paid, just not by the people who controlled her. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She wrote a letter, not to the guardian, not to the court, to herself. In it, she outlined what she would no longer accept: delays without explanation, decisions without transparency, authority without accountability. She did not send the letter. She kept it, a private record of intent, because Sarah understood something now that no one had taught her directly. Systems do not change because they are confronted. They change because they are outgrown. She would not fight the guardianship head-on. She would render it obsolete. The pressure continued. Weeks turned into months. The court maintained its careful distance. Porter remained cordial but guarded. The rhythm of delay persisted, and yet something had shifted permanently. Sarah was no longer reacting. She was setting terms, quietly, patiently, deliberately. When she finally lay down that night, she felt no triumph, only resolve. The system had shown her the price of being heard. She was willing to pay it, because some costs, once understood, are cheaper than silence. Sarah Rector did not seek the spotlight. That was precisely why it began to work for her. For years, attention had been something done to her. Newspapers writing her life into headlines, institutions shaping her image without consent, strangers projecting their ideas onto her name. Visibility had been a vulnerability, something that invited control. But now, Sarah began to understand a different truth. What cannot be hidden can sometimes be redirected. She noticed it first in the way people spoke about her when they thought she wasn't listening. Her name still carried weight, but the tone had shifted. Where once it had been curiosity or skepticism, it was now something closer to caution. Sarah Rector was no longer just a story. She was becoming a presence. At Tuskegee, administrators received inquiries, polite requests from journalists, academics, organizations interested in her progress. The school handled them carefully, aware that association with Sarah brought both prestige and scrutiny. Sarah watched how these requests were filtered. Which ones were welcomed? Which ones were quietly declined? She began to see how institutions curated narratives, not by lying, but by selecting. She paid attention. One afternoon, she was informed that a visiting delegation wished to meet her. Nothing official, no interviews, just a conversation, framed as interest in her education and future. Sarah agreed. She prepared carefully, not by rehearsing answers, but by deciding what she would not say. The meeting was cordial, respectful. The visitors spoke about opportunity, about how inspiring her story was, about the promise she represented. Sarah listened, then responded simply. "I'm still learning," she said, "mostly how systems work." The room grew quiet. It was not the answer they expected. Later, word of the meeting reached Oklahoma. The Guardian took notice. He wrote again, this time with a new tone, not defensive, not dismissive, attentive. He mentioned the importance of managing public perception, of ensuring that Sarah's image remained stable, responsible, aligned with expectations. He emphasized how visibility could be dangerous if mishandled. Sarah read the letter and smiled faintly. Visibility, she knew, was already dangerous, but danger was not the same as weakness. Back home, Joseph Rector sensed the shift in a different way. People no longer spoke freely around him. Conversations paused when he entered rooms. Officials who once controlled meetings now chose words with care. Sarah's questions had not just unsettled the system, they had alerted it. At Tuskegee, Sarah began to allow small pieces of herself to be seen, on her own terms. She participated in discussions, accepted invitations to speak. Briefly, thoughtfully. She never criticized openly. She never accused. She simply described what it was like to grow up wealthy and powerless, what it meant to have your name carry value you could not touch, what protection felt like when it excluded your voice. She spoke calmly, precisely. People listened, because her words did not sound like rebellion. They sounded like truth. The effect was subtle but cumulative. Articles began to shift tone, no longer sensational. They grew reflective. Questions replaced declarations. The guardianship system was discussed not as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience. Sarah's experience. The NAACP noticed. So did the court. Officials became more cautious. Decisions were reviewed more thoroughly. The Guardian's reports grew even more detailed, as if transparency alone could satisfy scrutiny. But transparency without power. Sarah understood. Was still control. She did not push harder. She let the pressure build naturally. One evening, as she walked across campus under a sky heavy with stars, Sarah thought again of the oil fields, how the pressure beneath the ground had built slowly over time, invisible until the moment it erupted. She was not erupting. She was accumulating, Every careful word, every measured appearance, every moment of being seen without being managed. The system had relied on her invisibility. It was now being forced to contend with her presence. The guardian sensed it more clearly than anyone. In his next letter, he mentioned potential adjustments, future discussions, the possibility of increased involvement as she matured. He was offering change, incrementally. Sarah recognized the tactic. Give just enough to preserve control. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she continued exactly as she had been, calm, informed, visible. She understood now that the spotlight was no longer something to avoid. It was something to stand in, carefully, deliberately, without flinching, because as long as eyes were watching, the system could not act as if she did not exist, and Sarah Rector was done being unseen. Institutions do not panic loudly. They panic by tightening rules. As Sarah Rector's public presence grew more defined, calm, articulate, unmistakably aware, the system around her began to respond in the only way it knew how. By reasserting boundaries that had never needed enforcement before. The court did not issue warnings. The guardian did not threaten. Instead, permissions became procedures. Conversations became correspondence. Access became conditional. At Tuskegee, administrators received updated guidance from Oklahoma. Nothing dramatic, just reminders. About security, about discretion, about the importance of limiting unsupervised contact with the press. They framed it as concern. Sarah understood it as containment. Invitations that once reached her directly were now filtered. Requests for interviews were declined on her behalf. Opportunities were delayed, then quietly forgotten. The message was clear. Visibility was acceptable, but only when curated. Sarah noticed the shift immediately. She had expected resistance. What surprised her was its subtlety. No one said she was forbidden from speaking. They simply made it harder for her to be heard. She adjusted. If they restricted access, she refined content. If they delayed meetings, she prepared questions. If they controlled timing, she controlled tone. Her words grew sharper, not louder, but clearer. Meanwhile, in Oklahoma, unease spread quietly through legal and financial circles. Sarah's case was being referenced again. Not as curiosity, but as precedent. Lawyers discussed it in hushed tones. Judges read articles they pretended not to care about. The guardianship system had survived scrutiny before, but never scrutiny that spoke from the inside. Porter felt it most acutely. For years, his authority had rested on assumption that Sarah would remain passive, grateful, distant from the machinery that governed her life. Now, that assumption no longer held. He began to document everything, every expense justified, every decision explained, every delay defended. It was not fear of wrongdoing that drove him, but fear of interpretation. Because once a narrative escaped control, facts alone could not contain it. Sarah received another letter from him, longer than usual. Carefully phrased, he expressed concern about misunderstandings arising from incomplete information. He emphasized how easily words could be misused by those with agendas. He suggested caution. Sarah read the letter twice. Then she noticed what it did not say. It did not deny her right to speak. It did not claim she was wrong. It only warned her of consequences. That was confirmation enough. At Tuskegee, Sarah was asked to attend a meeting with administrators. The tone was polite, but the intent was unmistakable. They spoke of reputation, of responsibility, of the school's position within broader systems of support. They asked her to be mindful. Sarah listened carefully. "I understand," she said when they finished. I've always been mindful. Her response unsettled them, because mindfulness was no longer enough. The pressure increased. A scheduled speaking engagement was postponed indefinitely. A planned publication declined to proceed without additional approvals. The machinery of delay began to hum again. Sarah felt the walls narrowing, but this time, she did not retreat. She remembered something her mother once told her, spoken quietly, years ago, when the letters first began to arrive. People only ask you to be quiet when your voice is working. Sarah leaned into that truth. She began documenting her own experience meticulously. Dates, conversations, changes in tone, shifts in access. Not for accusation, but for record. If the system insisted on procedure, she would master it. She reached out, carefully, indirectly, to allies who understood the terrain, educators, advocates, writers who knew how stories moved when power resisted them. Nothing public, nothing explosive, just awareness spreading quietly, like oil through porous ground. In Oklahoma, officials sensed the change. Meetings were held behind closed doors. The phrase risk management appeared more frequently in correspondence. The court began reviewing guardianship guidelines, not to reform them, but to reinforce them. But reinforcement, Sarah knew, was not resolution, it was resistance. And resistance meant impact. One evening, walking alone across campus as dusk settled, Sarah felt the weight of what she had set in motion. This was no longer about her alone. Her actions were beginning to ripple outward, touching systems that had long relied on invisibility. She understood now that progress would not come without consequence. Control, once threatened, rarely yielded gracefully. But she also understood something deeper. The system had lost its greatest advantage. It could no longer pretend she did not understand it. That knowledge, hers and theirs, changed everything. Sarah paused beneath a tall oak tree, listening to the wind move through its branches. The sound reminded her of Oklahoma, of open land, of pressure building beneath stillness. She was not rushing, she was not forcing. She was letting the moment ripen, because once an institution realizes it is being watched by the person it governs, its power begins to erode from the inside, and Sarah Rector was watching. Every system depends on one unspoken agreement, that the person inside it will eventually accept its limits. Sarah Rector understood this now with absolute clarity. For months, she had tested the edges, asking questions, shaping her presence, allowing visibility without surrender. She had watched the system respond with delay, with caution, with quiet resistance. It had not crushed her, but it had not yielded either. What stood between those two outcomes was a choice the system could never make for her. Whether she would continue to exist within its rules or step beyond the comfort of their expectations. The realization did not come as anger. It came as calm. Sarah sat alone in her room at Tuskegee one evening. Papers spread neatly across her desk. Reports, letters, notes she had written to herself over the years. They told the story of her life more clearly than any newspaper ever had. A child made wealthy by accident. A fortune placed under control for her own good. A voice encouraged only when it did not disrupt order. She read them slowly, deliberately. Then she set them aside. What mattered now was not what had been taken from her, but what she would claim. She thought about the offers that had been quietly suggested over time, the safe paths, the carefully managed future, the version of her life that required gratitude in exchange for comfort. She understood the appeal. Silence would cost her nothing in the short term. Compliance would keep doors open. Patience would preserve stability. But stability, she knew, was not the same as ownership. That night, Sarah wrote another letter. This one was different. It was addressed to the guardian, to the court, to the system itself. But she did not send it. Not yet. Instead, she refined it. She removed emotion. She removed accusation. She removed anything that could be dismissed as immaturity. What remained was simple, a statement of intent. She would no longer accept decisions made without her direct involvement. She would no longer be spoken for when she was capable of speaking herself. She would no longer allow her future to be managed as if she were a permanent exception. She was not asking for permission. She was preparing to assert standing. The next day, she requested a formal meeting, not a discussion, not a conversation. A meeting, with record, with witnesses, with purpose. The response was cautious. Dates were proposed, then adjusted. Conditions were mentioned. Language softened. Sarah agreed to none of it blindly. She insisted on clarity. That insistence changed everything. In Oklahoma, alarm bells rang quietly. This was no longer about image, no longer about narrative. This was about precedent. A ward who understood leverage. A minor who refused to remain abstract. A fortune that could no longer be managed invisibly. Porter felt the ground shift beneath him. For the first time, he considered what it would mean if Sarah's challenge succeeded, not just for her, but for every case like hers. The guardianship system relied on scale, on silence repeated thousands of times. One voice could unravel more than one arrangement. He advised caution. The court advised delay. Neither advised refusal, because refusal would have required justification. And justification was precisely what Sarah was demanding. At Tuskegee, administrators sensed the gravity of what she was doing. They offered support carefully, without endorsement, without resistance. They understood that history sometimes moved through moments that institutions could not safely guide. Sarah felt the weight of that solitude. There was no applause for what she was about to do, no guarantee of outcome, only consequence. She thought again of her parents, of her father's quiet endurance, of her mother's controlled resolve. They had survived systems by bending without breaking. Sarah would survive by refusing to bend where it mattered. The night before the meeting was finalized, Sarah walked alone across campus. The air was cool, the sky wide and dark. She stopped beneath the same oak tree she often passed and rested her hand against its rough bark. She felt steady, not fearless, but resolved. She understood now that freedom was not granted at the moment the law allowed it. It was claimed at the moment silence ended. Sarah Rector was no longer merely responding to pressure. She was applying it, and the line she had chosen to cross, once crossed, could not be uncrossed, because after that meeting, whether she won or lost, one truth would remain. She had stepped out of the role designed for her. And no system ever forgets the moment someone does that. The moment a challenge becomes official, it stops being personal. It becomes history. For years, Sarah Rector's life had existed in the margins of documents, her name printed boldly, her voice conspicuously absent. Decisions had been made in quiet rooms, justified with familiar phrases, preserved in ink that never questioned itself. That ended the day her presence entered the record. The meeting was held in a modest courtroom, unremarkable in every visible way. Wooden benches, tall windows, a judge's desk worn smooth by decades of authority. It was not a trial, not yet. It was framed as a review, a procedural matter concerning a minor's estate. But everyone in the room understood the truth. This was a reckoning. Sarah arrived composed, dressed simply, her posture steady. She did not look like the symbol newspapers once chased. She looked like what she had become, a young woman who understood where she stood. Her parents sat behind her, silent but resolute. The guardian, T.J. Porter, sat across the room, his papers arranged with careful precision. The court officials present spoke little at first, observing, measuring. When the judge finally addressed Sarah, his tone was polite, almost indulgent. "You've requested this meeting," he said. "Please explain your concerns." Sarah rose. She did not speak quickly. She did not speak defensively. She spoke clearly. "I am here," she said, "because decisions affecting my life and my estate have been made without my participation, despite my demonstrated capacity to understand them." The words landed softly, but firmly. The judge raised an eyebrow. "You are aware," he said, "that the guardianship exists for your protection." "Yes," Sarah replied. "I am also aware that protection without participation becomes exclusion." A murmur rippled through the room. Porter shifted in his chair. Sarah continued. "I am not asking for immediate control of my estate," she said. "I am asking for recognition as a person capable of understanding the decisions made in my name." She paused. "And for the opportunity to be heard before those decisions are finalized." The judge leaned back slightly. "That is not how the system works," he said. Sarah met his gaze. "Then the system," she said calmly, "is incomplete." Silence followed. Not the uncomfortable kind, the dangerous kind. The kind that forces people to confront what has been said rather than how it was said. Porter spoke next. His tone measured but defensive. He outlined years of responsible management. He cited growth, stability, safety. He emphasized the dangers Sarah had been shielded from: exploitation, publicity, risk. Sarah listened without interruption. When he finished, she responded with a single sentence. "I don't dispute what has been done," she said. "I question who has been allowed to decide." The court officials exchanged glances. This was not rebellion. This was logic. The judge asked questions now, not rhetorical, but practical, about Sarah's education, her understanding of contracts, her awareness of financial risk. Sarah answered each one directly. She did not exaggerate. She did not minimize. She demonstrated competence, not by asserting it, but by embodying it. For the first time, the room's dynamic shifted. This was no longer a discussion about whether Sarah Rector was capable. It was a discussion about why her capability had never mattered. The judge cleared his throat. "The law," he said carefully, "does not easily adapt to exceptions." Sarah nodded. "Neither does injustice," she replied. "That doesn't make it correct." The words were not accusatory. They were final. The meeting ended without resolution. No ruling was issued. No decision announced. But something irreversible had occurred. Sarah's challenge had been entered into the record. From that moment on, the guardianship was no longer an unquestioned arrangement. It was a documented dispute, a matter of discussion, a potential precedent. In the days that followed, reactions rippled outward. Lawyers took notice. Advocacy groups paid attention. Judges read transcripts more carefully than they admitted. The system could no longer pretend Sarah was passive. Back at Tuskegee, Sarah felt the weight of what she had done settle fully. This was no longer a private reckoning. It was a public one, controlled, contained, but undeniably real. She felt no triumph, only gravity, because she understood now that challenging a system did not guarantee change. It guaranteed resistance. Letters began arriving again, more formal, more cautious. The guardian requested further discussions. The court proposed additional evaluations. They were adjusting, not surrendering. Sarah recognized the pattern. The system was doing what it always did when confronted by clarity. It was buying time. She was prepared. Because time, at last, was something she understood how to use. She had stepped into the record, and the record, once written, does not forget. Systems do not fear opposition. They fear precedent. At first, Sarah Rector's challenge was treated as an anomaly, a singular case involving unusual wealth, unusual attention, and an unusually articulate young woman. Judges reassured themselves that it could be contained. Lawyers framed it as exceptional. Administrators described it as unique, but precedent does not announce itself as such. It arrives quietly, carried by repetition, within weeks of Sarah's appearance in court. Her name began to surface in conversations far beyond Oklahoma, not in headlines, but in footnotes, in legal correspondence, in the margins of briefs where difficult questions are parked until they can no longer be ignored. Other cases began to feel uncomfortably familiar. A minor with oil royalties managed by a guardian, parents excluded for protection, a court confident in its own restraint. Lawyers representing families in similar arrangements started citing Sarah Rector, not as an argument, but as a reference point. If she can be heard, they implied, why not this child? Judges noticed, not because they agreed, but because agreement was no longer the issue. Consistency was, in Oklahoma, the guardianship system had always relied on volume. Thousands of cases, handled quietly, with minimal scrutiny. Individual discomfort disappeared into administrative routine. Sarah's case interrupted that rhythm. She had not attacked the system. She had illuminated it, and illumination spreads. At the courthouse, clerks whispered about increased requests for hearings. Parents who had never questioned arrangements now asked what rights their children might have. Guardians found themselves explaining decisions they had never had to justify before. The tone of authority shifted, from certainty to defensiveness. Porter felt the change acutely. He was no longer just managing an estate. He was managing risk. Every decision now carried the possibility of interpretation. Every delay could be read as obstruction. Every action might be compared to Sarah's case. He began consulting legal counsel more frequently, not because he feared wrongdoing, but because he feared narrative. Narratives, once formed, were difficult to undo. Sarah watched all of this from a careful distance. She did not issue statements. She did not rally support publicly. She did not position herself as a leader. She simply continued to exist, visible, articulate, composed. And that was enough. At Tuskegee, she noticed the change in how faculty spoke to her, not with admiration, with respect. The difference mattered. Respect assumed agency. Admiration often did not. She received letters from families she had never met, parents of children with guardians, written in cautious language, asking not for help, but for understanding. How did you speak? What did you say? Were you afraid? Sarah read each one slowly. She did not answer all of them, but when she did, her replies were careful and restrained. I asked to be included, she wrote. I didn't ask to be rescued. I prepared before I spoke. She understood now that influence did not require leadership. It required example. In legal circles, resistance hardened. Judges began reinforcing procedural language, emphasizing statutory limits. Some rulings subtly narrowed opportunities for wards to be heard, framed as clarification rather than restriction. The system was adjusting, not to reform, but to protect itself. Sarah recognized the maneuver. Pressure had produced movement, but not yet direction. She remained patient, because she knew that systems rarely break under immediate strain. They fracture when internal contradictions become too visible to ignore. Her case had become such a contradiction. How could a child be trusted with millions in assets, yet deemed incapable of understanding them? How could protection justify exclusion indefinitely? How could guardianship claim benevolence while denying voice? These questions no longer belonged to Sarah alone. They belonged to the system. One afternoon, during a quiet walk across campus, Sarah realized something that surprised her. She was no longer alone in the record. Her challenge had created space. Not freedom, but possibility. The system could push back. It could delay. It could reinforce itself. But it could not return to ignorance. That realization brought neither joy nor fear, only responsibility. Because once a door opens, even slightly, someone must decide whether to walk through it. Sarah understood now that whatever happened next would extend beyond her own life. Her actions were already shaping outcomes for people she would never meet. That knowledge weighed heavily, but it also steadied her. She had never sought to dismantle the system. She had only insisted on being seen within it. The fact that this insistence unsettled so many others told her everything she needed to know. The water had been disturbed, and it would not settle back into silence. Institutions can delay only so long. Eventually, silence becomes an admission. By the time Sarah Rector's case returned to court, it was no longer treated as a procedural curiosity. It had become a reference point, quietly cited, carefully watched, and increasingly impossible to isolate. The system had reached a threshold. A response was required. The courtroom was fuller this time. Not crowded, but attentive. Lawyers sat straighter. Clerks moved more deliberately. The air carried a tension that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with consequence. Sarah entered without spectacle. She did not scan the room. She did not search for allies. She took her seat and waited. The judge began with formality, his tone measured, restrained. "This court recognizes," he said, "the concerns raised regarding participation and understanding." The language was cautious. Recognition was not concession. He continued, "However, the guardianship system exists to protect minors from undue influence and financial risk." Sarah listened, her expression neutral. Porter followed, presenting updated reports, revised protocols, assurances of oversight. He spoke of reforms, not changes to power, but changes to appearance, more transparency, more communication, more opportunity for explanation. The system, Sarah realized, was offering adaptation, not surrender, when it was her turn to speak. She stood calmly. "I appreciate the court's response," she said. "But transparency without agency is not participation." The judge raised his hand slightly. "You are still a minor," he reminded her. "Yes," Sarah replied. "But I am not invisible." The words settled heavily. This was the line the system could not cross back over. The judge asked a question that revealed everything. "What is it you are asking for?" Sarah did not hesitate. "For standing," she said. "Not control, not wealth. Standing. To be present," she continued. "When decisions are discussed, to have my understanding acknowledged, to have my objections recorded, even if they are not immediately accepted." The room was silent, because this request did not threaten collapse. It threatened precedent. The court recessed briefly. When they returned, the ruling was careful, crafted to appear narrow, controlled, reasonable. The guardianship would remain. Control would not transfer. But Sarah would be formally included in proceedings concerning her estate. She would receive full reports directly. Her objections would be entered into the record. Her participation would be acknowledged as relevant. It was not freedom, but it was no longer exclusion. The system had answered, not generously, not fully, but undeniably. Sarah sat very still as the ruling was read. She felt no surge of triumph, no release of tension, only confirmation. She had been heard. Outside the courtroom, reactions rippled quickly. Some called it progress. Others called it dangerous. A few called it inevitable. Porter was cordial afterward, careful with his words. "This is a reasonable outcome," he said. Sarah nodded. "It's a beginning," she replied, back at Tuskegee. The weight of what had happened finally settled. Sarah understood now that the system had not conceded out of goodwill. It had conceded out of necessity. Her presence, documented, composed, persistent, had made continued exclusion untenable. She also understood that this victory was incomplete. Standing was not power. Participation was not control. But both were irreversible. Once granted, they could not be easily withdrawn without exposing contradiction. Sarah had changed the terms of engagement. She was no longer a subject managed in silence. She was a participant on record. That distinction would shape everything that followed. That night, she walked alone beneath the familiar oak tree, the air still, the sky wide. She thought of her parents, of the land, of the long years spent waiting without voice. She thought of others, children whose names never reached headlines, whose cases never reached transcripts. Her victory did not free them, but it made their silence harder to justify. Sarah rested her hand against the tree's bark and allowed herself a moment, not of celebration, but of resolve. The system had answered. Now it would have to live with the consequences. Recognition changes things. Not all at once, not dramatically, but permanently. After the ruling, Sarah Rector's life did not transform overnight. There were no sweeping reforms, no sudden freedoms, no declarations of victory. The guardianship remained. The structures held. The oil continued to flow as it always had. What changed was quieter. She was now expected to attend meetings, expected to read reports, expected to understand. Expectation, Sarah realized, was a subtle form of power. For the first time, decisions about her estate were no longer complete without her presence. Her name was no longer sufficient by itself. Her voice, measured, deliberate, had to be accounted for. Even if it was not obeyed, that alone altered the rhythm of control. At Tuskegee, Sarah felt the shift in how she carried herself. She was no longer reacting to pressure. She was navigating consequence. The knowledge that her words now lived in official records weighed on her, not as fear, but as responsibility. Every sentence mattered. She learned quickly that being acknowledged did not mean being agreed with. Meetings often ended the same way they always had, with decisions made by others. But the difference was undeniable. Now, those decisions had to be defended. The Guardian's reports grew more thorough. Financial explanations were no longer summaries, but narratives. Where once numbers were enough, now reasoning was required. Sarah read everything. She did not challenge every choice. She did not object reflexively. She chose her moments. That restraint unsettled people more than constant resistance ever could. Porter began addressing her directly, not out of courtesy, but necessity. He explained strategies, asked for opinions framed as requests, acknowledged her understanding even when he did not yield. It was not equality, but it was no longer erasure. Sarah noticed how much effort the system now spent maintaining legitimacy. Meetings were scheduled carefully, language softened, decisions wrapped in consultation. The machinery had slowed, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. At Tuskegee, Sarah completed her studies with quiet distinction. She was no longer simply absorbing knowledge, she was applying it. Teachers recognized her discipline, her precision, her ability to see beyond the surface of arguments. She did not seek attention. Attention found her anyway. Journalists returned, cautiously this time, not chasing a child millionaire, but observing a young woman whose case had left a mark. Sarah declined most requests. When she spoke narrowly, about education, about patience, about understanding systems from the inside. She never dramatized her struggle. That restraint made her harder to dismiss. Back home, her parents lived differently now, not extravagantly, but with a dignity that had once been denied them. The house was solid, the table full. Neighbors spoke with respect that no longer felt conditional. But Joseph and Rose understood something their daughter now carried fully. Comfort was not freedom. Sarah returned home more often as she approached adulthood. Each visit reminded her of the long path she had walked, from the child who did not understand ownership, to the young woman whose name shaped rooms before she entered them. She stood once again on Oklahoma soil, the air still heavy with the scent of oil. The land at Glenpool lay unchanged on the surface, rocky, stubborn, ordinary. Beneath it, the same pressure endured. Sarah visited the site quietly, without ceremony. There were no revelations waiting for her there, only perspective. The land had not changed her, people had, and she had changed them back, just enough. One evening, sitting with her parents, Sarah spoke of the future, not in terms of wealth, in terms of choice. "I don't know what comes next," she said honestly, "but I know I won't disappear again." Her mother reached for her hand. "That's all we ever wanted," Rose said. Sarah understood then that acknowledgement was not an endpoint. It was a condition. She had secured the right to exist fully in the decisions that shaped her life. What she chose to do with that right would define the rest of her story. Outside, night settled over the plains, quiet and wide. Somewhere in the distance, oil pumps continued their endless motion, drawing wealth from the earth with tireless indifference. Sarah listened to the sound without resentment. It no longer defined her. She had learned to live not as a symbol, not as a ward, not as a headline, but as a person whose presence could not be removed from the story. And that, she knew, was the most enduring kind of power. Adulthood did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived quietly, through routine, responsibility, and the slow accumulation of choices that no longer required permission. When Sarah Rector reached maturity, the world expected transformation. Newspapers waited for spectacle. Institutions prepared for transition. People assumed wealth would finally step into the open, demanding attention it had long been denied. That was not what happened. Sarah did not announce herself as free. She did not celebrate control regained. She simply began living. Marriage came without headlines. She married Kenneth Ivey, a man who did not see her fortune as destiny or burden, but as something incidental, present, real, and not the center of who she was. Their relationship formed away from cameras, shaped by ordinary concerns, compatibility, trust. The quiet negotiations of shared life. They spoke of the future not in terms of money, but stability. Sarah insisted on that distinction. She had spent too much of her life being reduced to numbers. She would not allow adulthood to repeat the pattern. They built a home, solid, comfortable, unremarkable in the ways that mattered most. Sarah chose privacy deliberately. She did not reject her wealth, but she refused to let it perform in public. She was polite but reserved in private. She was decisive. She managed her affairs carefully, informed by years of watching others do it for her, where once she had studied contracts to understand control. Now she used them to define boundaries. She invested cautiously. She supported family quietly. She gave where it mattered, not where it was visible. People noticed and were confused. Why did she not live extravagantly? Why did she not speak more publicly? Why did she not capitalize on her story? Sarah never answered those questions directly. She had learned that explanation often invites ownership. Instead, she lived in a way that made speculation irrelevant. Her parents aged with dignity, their later years marked by security rather than fear. Sarah ensured they lacked nothing, but never allowed comfort to become dependence. She understood the danger of replacing one form of control with another. Family, to her, meant choice, not obligation enforced by wealth in the broader world. Her name faded from headlines. This was not a failure. It was intentional. The story that had once consumed journalists no longer fit their narratives. Sarah did not embody triumph or tragedy in a way that could be easily packaged. She did not perform gratitude. She did not stage rebellion. She simply existed, competent, composed, unremarkable on purpose, yet beneath that quiet life. The consequences of her earlier challenge continued to ripple. Guardianship practices shifted incrementally, not because the system had reformed, but because it had been forced to adapt. Courts began recording Ward's statements more consistently. Procedures changed language. Expectations adjusted. Small changes. But systems move through accumulation, not confession. Sarah was aware of these developments, but she did not claim them. She did not need to. Her role had never been to dismantle institutions. It had been to refuse disappearance within them. As years passed, oil production slowed, fortunes stabilized. The land at Glenpool returned gradually to obscurity. Its moment of eruption folded into history. Sarah visited it once more, not out of nostalgia, but closure, standing on the same ground that had reshaped her life. She felt no sense of ownership, only understanding. The land had never belonged to her in the way people assumed. It had been a catalyst, not a definition. Her life had been shaped less by wealth than by the systems that rushed to contain it, and by her decision to outgrow them. In her home, evenings were quiet, conversations ordinary, the rhythm of daily life steady. Sarah found comfort in things she had once been denied. Routine, predictability, choice without surveillance. She read often, thought deeply, spoke selectively. She had no desire to be remembered as an exception. She preferred to be remembered, if at all, as someone who insisted on being present in her own life. That insistence had cost her ease, but it had given her something far rarer: control without spectacle, freedom without performance, a life shaped not by accident, but by intention. As the years moved on, Sarah Rector became what the system had never planned for. Not a problem, not a symbol, a woman who owned her story by refusing to sell it. There is a difference between memory and legacy. Memory clings to events. Legacy shapes what follows. Sarah Rector understood this distinction only later, when enough time had passed for her life to feel settled, not complete, but grounded. The urgency that once defined her youth had softened into perspective. The battles that had consumed courtrooms and correspondence now lived quietly in archives, referenced occasionally, rarely examined closely. She was no longer at the center of anything, and that, she realized, was a choice she had earned in the quiet of her home. Sarah sometimes revisited the past, not with longing, but with clarity. She thought of the girl she had been, confused by ownership, watched by strangers, managed by systems that spoke in her name. That girl had not imagined resistance. She had imagined understanding, and understanding, Sarah now knew, was the most dangerous thing she had ever acquired. The wealth that once defined her in the public imagination had receded into the background of her life. It existed, certainly, structured, managed, secure, but it no longer dictated her days. Money paid for stability, not identity. It provided margin, not meaning. What defined her instead were the boundaries she had drawn. She chose privacy when visibility was available. She chose restraint when spectacle was expected. She chose presence where silence had once been imposed. Those choices were invisible to most people, but they shaped everything. From time to time, Sarah would receive letters from students, scholars, or advocates who had encountered her name in research. They wrote carefully, respectfully, often uncertain whether they should write at all. They asked what it had been like. Sarah answered rarely. When she did, her responses were brief. I learned to listen before I spoke. I learned that being included matters. I learned that systems change slowly, but people can change how they move within them. She did not frame herself as heroic. She resisted that narrative deliberately. Heroes are exceptions. Exceptions excuse systems. Sarah had never wanted to be an exception. She had wanted to be counted. As the years passed, she watched the world change in ways both subtle and profound. Laws evolved. Language shifted. New conversations emerged around rights, guardianship, autonomy. Progress arrived unevenly, imperfectly, but unmistakably. She knew better than to claim credit. But she also knew that moments mattered. Her challenge had not rewritten the system. It had interrupted it. That interruption had allowed others to step forward with fewer obstacles, fewer assumptions stacked against them. It had created space, small, fragile, but real. In moments of reflection, Sarah thought again of the land at Glen Pool. The oil was gone now, or nearly so. The ground had returned to quiet, its moment of transformation complete. It no longer attracted attention. It no longer promised sudden fortune. It simply existed. She found comfort in that. The land had taught her something no courtroom ever could. That pressure builds unseen. That change does not announce itself. That what remains after extraction is not emptiness, but altered possibility. Sarah's life had followed a similar arc. The noise had passed. The attention had faded. What remained was agency. She lived without needing to prove it. In her later years, Sarah was asked once, by someone young, earnest, searching, whether she regretted not doing more publicly. She considered the question carefully before answering. No, she said, because I did enough to be heard. That answer confused the questioner. It satisfied Sarah. Legacy, she had learned, was not about how loudly one spoke. It was about whether silence was ever acceptable again. Her name no longer appeared in headlines. It appeared in records, in footnotes, in conversations where someone asked, quietly but insistently, why wasn't she allowed to speak? That question lingered, and as long as it did, Sarah Rector's presence remained, not as a story told, but as a standard implied. She did not need monuments. She had changed the shape of absence. As evening settled outside her window, Sarah closed a book and set it aside. The day ended as it always did, without ceremony. without announcement. She was content with that, because the greatest victory of her life had never been wealth, or recognition, or even justice. It had been the simple, hard-won right to exist fully, without explanation, without permission, without being reduced to silence again. History rarely changes because of one person. It changes because one life reveals a pattern that can no longer be denied. By the time Sarah Rector's name settled into archives and academic footnotes, it had stopped belonging solely to her. It had become shorthand, quietly invoked in discussions of guardianship, race, and control, not as a legend, as a reference, a case. Historians looking back did not see drama first. They saw structure. They saw how Sarah's story mirrored dozens of others, children whose land produced wealth they never touched, whose futures were managed through language that sounded protective but functioned as exclusion. They saw how guardianship operated not as an exception, but as a system refined through repetition. Sarah had not been alone. She had been visible, in Oklahoma and beyond. Records told a familiar story. Indigenous and Black children allotted land deemed worthless, only to find it suddenly valuable. Fortunes placed under control. Parents sidelined. Courts confident in their restraint. The pattern repeated with minor variations. Sarah Rector's difference was not her wealth. It was her interruption. Where most stories ended in silence, hers entered the record with questions intact. Legal scholars began to examine what her challenge had exposed, not corruption in the dramatic sense, but something more durable. A framework designed to centralize authority while maintaining the appearance of care. Protection as justification. Delay as discipline. Silence as stability. Sarah's insistence on participation had not dismantled that framework, but it had made its logic visible. That visibility mattered in classrooms. Professors began using her case to illustrate how power operated without overt violence, how systems could maintain control through procedure rather than force, how legality and justice often diverged quietly. Students read transcripts. They underlined phrases. They asked questions Sarah herself had once asked. Why was understanding not enough? Why was wealth dangerous only when held by certain people? Why was maturity measured selectively? These questions unsettled easy narratives. Outside academia, advocacy groups referenced her story when pushing for incremental reform. Not sweeping change, but documentation, inclusion, the right to be heard. They did not call it the Rector rule. They did not name movements after her. They simply pointed. Here is what happened. Here is what was allowed. Here is what changed when someone spoke. Sarah watched these developments from a distance, her role complete. She did not participate in debates about her legacy. She did not correct interpretations or defend her choices. History, she understood, did not belong to the people who lived it. It belonged to those who used it. Her story now lived among others, children who never challenged their guardians, whose names never appeared in transcripts, whose silence remained intact. The contrast was stark, not because Sarah had succeeded completely, but because she had disrupted expectation. She had forced the system to acknowledge a person where it had preferred a category. That acknowledgement, historians would later argue, was the true fracture point, not wealth, not race alone, not publicity, agency. In courtrooms, decades later, judges occasionally referenced the need for clear communication with wards. Language softened, procedures adjusted, participation was framed as beneficial rather than disruptive. Small changes, but small changes accumulate. The guardianship system did not collapse, it adapted, and adaptation, in history, is often the closest thing to accountability. Sarah's life, viewed through this lens, appeared almost understated. There were no dramatic final confrontations, no public victories to celebrate, no sweeping reforms bearing her name. Instead, there was something quieter, a measurable shift in how absence was justified. Where once silence had been assumed, it now had to be explained. That burden mattered. In later years, Sarah was occasionally invited to speak at events commemorating legal progress or social change. She declined most invitations, accepting only those that allowed her to remain precise rather than symbolic. When she did speak, she spoke carefully. "I didn't change the system," she would say. "I changed my position inside it." That distinction confused some listeners. It clarified everything for others. History, she knew, was not made by those who waited for permission. It was shaped by those who refused to disappear quietly. Sarah Rector's life had not rewritten the law, but it had altered the questions future generations would be forced to ask. And once a question enters history, it never fully leaves. For every story that enters history, dozens disappear without leaving a trace. Sarah Rector's case survived because it was interrupted, because questions were asked, because silence broke before it hardened into fate. Most stories did not end that way. In the same counties where Sarah's name appeared in court transcripts, there were other children, Black, Indigenous, poor, whose land produced wealth quietly while their lives shrank around it. Their names lived only in ledgers. Their futures were shaped by decisions they never heard. No one wrote about them. They did not appear in newspapers. They were not referenced in legal journals. Their cases were processed efficiently, professionally, and without disruption, which was precisely the problem. A boy whose oil royalties paid for buildings he would never enter. A girl whose guardian purchased property in her name she would never see. Children who reached adulthood to find estates diminished, opportunities deferred, questions unanswered. Their silence was not consent. It was expectation. Historians piecing together guardianship records decades later found patterns that felt chilling in their consistency. Minor wards whose parents were deemed unfit by default. Reports that justified expenses vaguely. Courts that approved renewals without review. The language repeated itself. For the child's own good. To prevent exploitation. Until maturity is reached. Maturity, for many, arrived too late to matter. Some children grew up believing poverty was normal, unaware that wealth had once moved through their names. Others sensed something was wrong but lacked the education, confidence, or access to challenge it. They did not confront the system. They adapted to it. Sarah Rector's story cast these lives into sharper relief, not because she had escaped entirely, but because she had asked what others never could. Why am I not included? Who decides when I am ready? What happens if I speak? For those who never spoke, the answers remained buried. Records showed guardians who managed dozens of estates simultaneously, each treated as routine. Judges rotated through cases with efficiency that left no room for nuance. Silence smoothed the process. It made control economical, in some files. Historians found handwritten notes, questions scribbled and never answered. In others, there were no notes at all, just signatures, dates, final balances that told a story no one had been allowed to question. The absence was striking, not dramatic absence, administrative absence. Lives reduced to compliance. These parallel stories revealed the true cost of systems built on assumption rather than engagement. They showed how easily legality could mask harm when no one demanded explanation. Sarah's interruption had not saved them, but it illuminated what had been done in lectures and classrooms. Scholars began pairing her case with these unnamed lives, not to elevate her, but to contextualize her, to show that her story was not exceptional in its injustice, only in its resistance. Students were asked to compare files. One with questions entered into record, one without. The difference was unmistakable. Where Sarah's file grew thicker, layered with responses, revisions, acknowledgments, others remained thin, untouched, resolved. Silence, it turned out, left no paper trail. Advocates used these comparisons carefully. They did not claim the system was malicious. They argued something harder to refute, that it was indifferent. Indifference did not require cruelty. It required compliance. Sarah had disrupted that compliance. Others had not been given the chance. Some of those children grew into adults who carried a sense of loss they could never fully explain. They knew something had been taken, but not how, or when, or by whom. The system had done its work too quietly. Their stories ended without confrontation, without closure, without record. Sarah was aware of these parallels. They did not make her proud. They made her sober. She understood now that her life was not a template to be celebrated, but a contrast to be examined. The difference between her story and theirs lay not in character or worth, but in access and timing. She had been educated. She had been visible. She had learned the language of power early enough to use it. Others had not. That knowledge sat heavily with her. In private conversations, she sometimes spoke of this imbalance, not with guilt, but with clarity. "I wasn't braver," she said once. "I was positioned." That distinction mattered. History often mistakes position for virtue. Sarah refused that mistake. Her legacy, she believed, was not proof of what individuals could overcome, but evidence of what systems allowed only under pressure. The unnamed lives in the archives told the other half of the story. They reminded anyone who looked closely that justice delayed was not always justice denied. Sometimes it was simply forgotten. Sarah Rector's voice had entered the record. The others remained silent, not by choice, but by design. And that silence, preserved in files and omissions, spoke volumes to anyone willing to listen. Systems rarely confess, they adapt. Looking back, historians would note that Sarah Rector's case did not trigger a revolution. No sweeping legislation followed. No public reckoning dismantled the guardianship framework that had governed thousands of lives. What happened instead was quieter and more revealing. The system learned just enough to survive. In the years after Sarah's challenge entered the record, procedural language shifted. Courts emphasized communication. Guardians were encouraged to provide clearer explanations. Wards were occasionally invited to observe proceedings that affected them. These changes were documented as progress, and in a narrow sense, they were, but the foundation remained untouched. Authority still flowed in one direction. Control still rested with institutions. Participation was permitted, but not empowered. The system had learned that exclusion was risky when visible. It had not learned that exclusion was wrong. That distinction mattered. Sarah's case taught institutions how to manage dissent without surrendering dominance. It demonstrated that allowing limited voice could preserve legitimacy while maintaining control. Standing could be granted. Agency could be delayed. From the system's perspective, this was not failure. It was optimization. Legal scholars would later describe this pattern as adaptive containment, the process by which institutions absorb challenges by incorporating their language while resisting their substance. Sarah Rector's life was a case study in that process. Her challenge forced the system to respond. But it also showed the system how far it could bend without breaking, how much acknowledgement was enough to diffuse pressure. In that sense, the system did learn something essential. It learned how dangerous silence could be, and how to manage it. But there was something it never learned. It never learned to trust the people it governed. The guardianship structure continued to assume incompetence by default. It continued to measure maturity selectively. It continued to rely on hierarchy rather than relationship. What changed was not belief, but optics. Sarah understood this clearly. She did not mistake adaptation for justice. She had never expected the system to apologize. Systems do not apologize, they persist. What mattered to her was that persistence now carried a scar, a visible mark where certainty had once been absolute. That mark altered future interactions in ways too subtle for headlines, but too real to ignore. Judges asked more questions. Guardians documented more carefully. Silence required explanation. The burden had shifted, slightly, but permanently. Sarah's story also exposed something more uncomfortable, that the system's greatest failure was not cruelty, but convenience. It was easier to manage people than to engage them, easier to assume than to listen, easier to delay than to decide fairly. Her challenge made inconvenience visible, and inconvenience, in bureaucratic systems, is often the first step toward change. Still, Sarah knew the limits of what she had done. She had not freed others. She had not dismantled injustice. She had carved out a space where absence could no longer hide. That space was fragile. It required vigilance. It required memory. And memory, she knew, was not guaranteed. History has a way of smoothing edges, of turning conflicts into lessons without consequence, of celebrating individuals while forgetting structures. Sarah resisted that narrative when asked what the system had learned from her case. She answered simply, that it couldn't ignore me. When asked what it had failed to learn, she did not hesitate. That it shouldn't have tried. That distinction mattered. The system had adjusted to pressure, not principle, and yet, pressure changes landscapes. Rivers carve stone not by force, but by persistence. Sarah Rector's life was not a victory over the system. It was a record of resistance that refused to vanish. In the end, what the system learned was not justice, but caution. What it refused to learn was humility. And between those two truths lived the legacy Sarah left behind. Not a solution, a question. One that history would continue to ask. Quietly, but insistently. Every time a child was managed in silence. Who decides, and why? Most stories end with a moment, a victory, a fall, a final declaration. Sarah Rector's did not. Her life ended the way it had ultimately been lived, without spectacle, without announcement, without asking to be remembered. By the time history began to move on without her, Sarah had already done so. She lived her later years quietly, her days shaped by routine rather than conflict. The urgency that once defined her youth had long since dissolved into something steadier, discernment. She read widely. She followed the world without feeling obligated to intervene in it. She maintained distance not as retreat, but as boundary. Those who knew her personally did not speak of her wealth. They spoke of her composure, of how she listened longer than she spoke, of how she asked questions that lingered after conversations ended, of how she never confused attention with importance. To them, Sarah was not history. She was presence. The institutions that had once managed her life rarely spoke her name anymore. Her case remained in records, cited occasionally, footnoted when relevant. It had become settled, not resolved, but absorbed into the quiet architecture of precedent. This, too, was how systems survived. They moved on. Sarah watched this with neither bitterness nor satisfaction. She had never believed institutions owed her gratitude. What mattered was that they could no longer pretend she had not existed. That knowledge was enough. When she passed, there were no headlines, no declarations of significance, no sudden reassessments of her impact, just an entry in the public record, a life concluded. For a moment, it seemed as if the story had ended. But stories do not end where lives do. Years later, students would encounter her name in a paragraph and pause, not because it was dramatic, but because it was unsettling. The details refused easy resolution. The outcomes felt incomplete. That incompleteness was the point. Sarah Rector's life did not offer closure. It offered clarity. She had not escaped the system entirely. She had not transformed it completely. She had exposed its shape, and that exposure lingered. In courtrooms long after her death, judges faced questions that felt uncomfortably familiar. In classrooms, discussions stalled at the same fault lines. In advocacy work, her case resurfaced as a reminder that participation was not a gift, but a demand. Sarah herself was no longer there to speak, but the absence of her voice carried weight. It forced others to answer questions she had asked decades earlier. Who benefits from silence? Who decides when someone is ready to be heard? What does protection become when it excludes agency? These questions did not belong to the past. They belonged to every present shaped by inherited systems. Sarah Rector had not intended to become a lesson. She had intended to live. That she did, and in doing so, carefully, deliberately, without spectacle, she left behind something more durable than wealth or recognition. She left behind a disruption that never fully healed, a reminder that once someone insists on being present in their own life, silence can never again be treated as neutral. History moved on, but it moved differently. Because once a system has been forced to acknowledge a person it tried to manage in absence, it never quite forgets how fragile its certainty once became. Sarah Rector stepped out of history, but the space she carved inside it remained. At some point, every story stops belonging to the person who lived it. It turns outward. Sarah Rector's life does not ask to be admired. It does not invite sympathy. It does not resolve into inspiration in the way we are accustomed to. Instead, it leaves something unfinished. And unfinished stories are dangerous. Because they do not tell us what to think. They ask us what we are willing to accept. Sarah's story forces a reckoning not with the past, but with the present, with the systems we inherit and rarely question, with the quiet arrangements that shape lives without ever announcing themselves. It asks something uncomfortable. If this happened once, how often has it happened since? We like to believe injustice announces itself clearly, that it arrives with cruelty, with villains, with obvious wrongdoing. But Sarah's life offers no such clarity. There were no monsters here, no dramatic theft, no moment where everyone agreed a line had been crossed. There was procedure, there was intention, there was protection that quietly became control. And that is what makes the story difficult to sit with, because it does not allow distance. It does not say they were evil. It says this was normal. The guardians believed they were doing their duty. The courts believed they were preserving order. The system believed it was being reasonable. And yet, a child was excluded from her own life. Not violently, not maliciously, administratively. Sarah Rector did not defeat this system. She revealed it. And revelation is more unsettling than accusation. Because once something is revealed, it cannot be unseen. The question then shifts. not to history, but to us. Where does this still happen? Who is being protected today in ways that deny voice? Who is managed so efficiently that no one notices what is missing? We still live among systems that confuse care with control, that reward silence, that call compliance maturity, that delay agency until it loses urgency. Sarah's life does not accuse us directly. It asks whether we recognize these patterns when they no longer wear the language of the past. We are uncomfortable with stories like hers because they offer no easy resolution, no moment where justice triumphs and we are allowed to feel finished. Instead, we are left with responsibility. Responsibility to notice. Responsibility to ask who is absent from the room. Responsibility to question whether legality has replaced fairness. Sarah's refusal to disappear is not heroic, it is human, and that is what makes it dangerous to systems that rely on silence. Her life tells us that power does not always announce itself loudly. Often, it whispers through paperwork, timelines, and polite explanations. And resistance does not always look like rebellion, sometimes. It looks like a question asked at the wrong time. Sometimes, it looks like insisting on being present. The story ends not with Sarah, but with the space she leaves behind. A space where silence no longer feels neutral. A space where absence demands explanation. A space that now belongs to whoever is listening. Because the final question of this story is not historical. It is personal. If you had been there, would you have noticed? If you were inside the system, would you have questioned it? If you benefited from the arrangement, would you have been willing to change it? Sarah Rector does not answer these questions for us. She leaves them open, and that is her final act. Not to resolve history, but to refuse to let it rest comfortably. History prefers endings, clean conclusions, clear lessons, a sense that something has been resolved. Sarah Rector's story refuses that comfort. There is no final triumph here, no moment when the system collapses, no scene where justice stands whole and undisputed. Instead, there is an absence, and absence, when it is intentional, is powerful. Sarah Rector did not die as a symbol. She did not live as one either. She passed through history the way pressure passes through stone, quietly, persistently, altering its shape without leaving her name carved on the surface. The world did not stop for her. Institutions did not repent. Power did not apologize. What changed was subtler. Silence lost its innocence. After Sarah, absence required explanation. After Sarah, exclusion needed language. After Sarah, systems learned that being questioned, even once, left a mark that procedure alone could not erase. That mark is still there. You can find it whenever someone asks why a decision was made without those most affected present. Whenever a policy is challenged not for its cruelty, but for its assumptions. Whenever protection is questioned instead of praised automatically. These moments do not announce her name. They do not need to. Sarah Rector's legacy was never about recognition. It was about friction. She introduced resistance into a system that depended on smoothness. She slowed processes designed to move unquestioned. She insisted that understanding mattered even when the law said it did not. And then, she stepped away. She did not stay to supervise her impact. She did not narrate her own meaning. She trusted that once silence had been broken, it would never fully return to its old shape. That trust is the final risk she took. Because history does not guarantee memory. It only guarantees repetition, unless interrupted. Sarah Rector interrupted something. Not enough to end it, enough to expose it. And exposure is irreversible. The question her life leaves behind is not about wealth, or race, or guardianship alone. It is about power that insists it is reasonable, about systems that claim neutrality while shaping lives invisibly, about how easily care becomes control when no one is expected to object, and finally, it is about us. Because every generation inherits structures it did not build and decides, quietly or deliberately, whether to accept them as inevitable. Sarah Rector did not offer a roadmap. She offered a moment of clarity, a moment when silence stopped being the default. That moment is still available. It appears whenever someone notices who is missing from the room, whenever someone asks not what is allowed, but who decides, whenever someone refuses to disappear politely. The story ends here, but the question does not, and that is